Who among us hasn't had the unsettling experience of thinking about someone when suddenly the phone rings and that person is calling? Or how many times have we heard about a friend who wakes up in the middle of the night with a premonition, sometimes tragic, that later comes true? These psychic phenomena and others like them are increasingly the object of scientific research in the United States and around the world. 60 Minutes set out to chronicle some of that research. In a research laboratory in Brooklyn, sliced ping pong balls over a woman's eyes fill her vision with opaque light. All she can hear is the sound of waves crashing against a shore. In a room next door, a man is suspended in a contraption called the witch's cradle, his eyes covered, his earphones playing constant static. These two are clearing their minds. They are going through something called sensory deprivation, preparing them for an ESP experience. In the Soviet Union, a film tells of a Russian woman who claims she can move objects across a table without touching them by means of psychokinesis, the energy that pours out of her fingertips, a phenomenon that defies the laws of physics. Are these things real? Laboratory-controlled telepathy? Psychic power that can move physical objects? Real or not, they are part of a growing scientific interest in psychic phenomena.
I'm going to disconnect now, Tom.
If you accept the theory that humans can communicate at an extrasensory level, why rule out a whole other order of living things, like plants?
I'm changing frequency.
This is the hypothesis of Marcel Vogel of IBM in California. Vogel spends his days at IBM as a hard scientist. But after hours and on weekends, he tries to communicate by psychic force with the plant world. The plant in question is a rather wan split philodendron, which Vogel has hooked up to a polygraph machine. The morning we filmed this, Vogel observed, while one of his colleagues, who claims psychic power, took a trip inside the plant itself. In the psychic world, this is sometimes referred to as out-of-body experience.
Now, as we are one with the plant,
right,
let us now look at the cell structure that is present in the stem of the plant.
All right, I'm in the leaf. Let me get down into the stem. Okay, I'm in the stem.
Fine. Now look at the wall cells in the stem and describe what you are now seeing.
All right, I started out more toward the center of the stem. Now what I'll do is I'll just go back up into the leaf. There I am. I'm in the leaf now.
All right, now I'm out.
Go back up into the leaf.
During the trip, Vogel monitors the polygraph to note the philodendron's reaction to the strange visitor.
Now what I'm going to do is generate energy out to the plant. Let's see what happens.
There it goes. There's a response. Send me. The exciting thing is that the plant is not connected to either one of us, but is now a very sensitive monitor of the forces that are within us.
It's dark. It's dark.
Vogel and his associates believe that plants react to psychic forces around them in a way that can be measured by scientific instruments. An independent research organization in California known as the Stanford Research Institute contracted to study psychic phenomena under laboratory conditions. Last fall, they spent several weeks with a 25-year-old Israeli psychic named Uri Geller, and they cataloged a series of remarkable feats. He went through a series of experiments, but either my skepticism or the presence of two cameras had a negative effect. Although he claims to be able to start broken watches by passing his hand over them, he couldn't start the one we brought with us.
But just 2 days ago in a demonstration, they brought me 5 watches, and I fixed all of them.
Really? Geller asked me to draw a letter while his back was turned. I drew the letter L, and then he drew something similar. Later, while we were not filming, he psychically bent a knife which was on the table. He had not been willing to try this while the cameras were rolling. He asked me to draw an object while he was out of the room, and he tried to read my mind, to tell me what it was.
Okay, I'm going to put 2 things that appeared in my mind, and if I'm wrong, you show me what. The first thing that, when I asked, is it a part of a man, the first thing appeared to me was something like this, like this, like this, like this. And then when you kept repeating the word, a B appeared in my mind, and I might be completely wrong. Again, I'm saying it to you. And then this changed to another. Okay, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. This changed to some sort of a bird or something. I'm wrong?
You're right.
I'm right? Thanks God.
The fact is that in this field that has been plagued with frauds and charlatans, many serious people at many prestigious centers of learning in this country and abroad are spending their time investigating further in this provocative field of study. The amount of foolproof, repeatable scientific data so far has been negligible, but the work continues and the interest grows.
Well, have you ever felt that someone was watching you, but there was really no one there? What if someone really was watching? Well, in tonight's special assignment, Ross Blackstone introduces us to Northern Californians who say the government is monitoring their every move, reading their thoughts, and controlling their minds.
It's an entire program. It's a stalking, harassment, surveillance, torture.
Marianne Stratton says she is a walking human experiment.
You can't go anywhere without somebody following you, knowing they know what you buy, they know what you purchase.
At this rally last summer, Stratton and others explained how the government monitors their thoughts through ultra-frequency radio waves sent by any energy source directly to the electromagnetic waves in their brains.
And like I said, they can tune it to any human that they want in this country, just like a radio frequency, an FM, like an FM station.
They say the waves can also control their minds and their bodies.
They can cause your heart to hurt, they can cause you blast your stomach, they can cause your ankles to give out, they can cause your knees to give out. Whatever they direct it to, wherever they can direct the pain to, your body feels all of it.
Why? They claim the government is perfecting mind control technology to use in war.
And it's all a form of terrorism and torture to drive the targeted subject insane, to drive the human insane.
The government has confessed to similar operations in the past using LSD or hypnosis. Now, hundreds of self-proclaimed mind control victims say these documents prove it's happening again. On special assignment, I'm Ross Blackstone for KOVR 13 News.
And on our 6 o'clock special assignment, Ross is going to introduce us to a woman who's leading the fight to disclose this information in Northern California. Have you ever listened to that little voice in your head? Most people consider that their conscience, maybe their intuition. But in tonight's special assignment, Ross Blackstone explains that voice may not be yours at all. Some say it could be the government controlling your mind.
Cheryl Welsh lives in Davis and studies law at Lincoln. She says she's also a victim of street theater, an experiment in which the government controls the minds of everyone around her.
Wherever I go about in my day, people will spit, swear, blow smoke in my face, basically 100 insults a day. You know, and
the purpose, Cheryl says, is to observe how she reacts so the government can study her mind and eventually use the same technology to control the minds of America's enemies. If that sounds crazy to you, Cheryl says the government is succeeding.
You know, you discredit the enemy. You make them look like a kook. And if you can imagine the government's motive, I mean, if you can read a person's mind, you're not going to reveal that for anything.
She's not the only one. Cheryl has organized a group called Citizens Against Human Rights Abuse that has attracted hundreds of self-proclaimed victims from California and all over the world.
I'm just trying to organize, I guess, and gather the information and get the information out, because I don't think the public has it.
She's gathered documents like this from the United Nations that suggest banning electromagnetic weapons because of their biological effects on people. She's also collected papers that she says shows long-term American goals.
I've got the documents from NASA, from Federal Times, from back in the 70s, the DIA, talking about how they were going to use this microwave hearing to drive political targets crazy.
Welsh says more and more people are stepping forward to say now it's coming true. On special assignment, Ross Blackstone, KOVR 13 News.
Well, when our special assignment continues on the 10 o'clock news, you'll find out if electromagnetic mind control is even possible and how. Periodically, over the past several decades, we've heard of situations when the U.S. government has experimented on human beings. Some cases have involved nuclear weapons, others, LSD and mind control. So is it possible something similar could happen to us right now without our knowledge? In tonight's special assignment, Ross Blackstone introduces us to Northern Californians who say it is, and that they have proof.
Imagine everywhere you go, someone is watching, reading your thoughts, controlling your mind.
They know what you do inside your house, which you're being monitored, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
At the state capitol last summer, Marianne Stratton rallied with dozens of other Californians who say it's happening to them through ultra-frequency radio waves.
I can be in a room full of 1,000 people, but it'll only affect me.
They believe the government is sending radio waves to directly affect the unique electromagnetic waves in their brains. That way it can control their thoughts and bodies.
Pain is unbelievable, okay? Enough to make you pass out. If you've ever broken a bone, you want to know what pain. A bone, you want to know what pain. You want to know what pain.
Did you see how she stumbled there? After our interview, Stratton said the government made her throat swell so she would have trouble talking to us.
And it's electronic harassment, but it seems as when you become actively involved with disclosing this information, it becomes torture.
They believe the government is testing mind control tactics to use in war, and anyone could be targeted. Some are uneducated people with no ties. Others have information the government wants to monitor.
It could be because of law enforcement. It could be because you're a whistleblower. It could be because you were in the Army, Navy.
And they say there's nothing you can do to protect yourself. They also claim minds are controlled different ways. Cheryl Welsh says the government uses radio waves to affect other people around her so as to study her mental reactions.
Wherever I go about in my day, people will spit, swear, blow smoke in my face, basically 100 insults a day.
Sounds far-fetched? Well, don't make up your mind just yet. Some say they have research going back more than 40 years, which says it's possible.
I've got the documents from NASA, from Federal Times, from back in the 70s, the DIA, talking about how they were going to use this microwave hearing to drive political targets crazy.
Welsh is also a law student at Lincoln. Through her organization, Citizens Against Human Rights Abuse, she shared documents she's gathered with hundreds of people around the world. Documents like this from the United Nations.
It talks about the electromagnetic weapons, and the Russians wanted to ban the weapons.
Welsh is not the only one. In his latest book, Earth Rising, renowned author and speaker Nick Begich cites more than 30 patents that show mind control is possible by using light, sound, or electronic fields.
As long as the pulse rate is correct and hits a window frequency.
He uses an example from 1997, when more than 600 Japanese children went into epileptic seizures while watching a cartoon, which flashed a light at a certain rate. Similarly, he says if a radio wave is sent at the right frequency to an acupuncture point on the skin, it will translate into an auditory signal that is sent directly to the brain. Begich used this infrasound device to demonstrate on me.
I can hear it when you press it to my skin, but not when you take it off.
Right.
So that's sending the signal through my skin.
Through your nervous system, right into the brain, and the brain is decoding it. And so it's almost like it's right in the center of your head.
And you can do that even if you weren't touching my skin?
Not with this device, but if I were using a microwave carrier at a distance, we could achieve the same thing.
He says the sound could then be used to control my behavior, and the waves can be sent through any energy source, radio towers, indoor lights, especially the internet. It would be difficult to target specific people like Orr, Stratton, or Welsh.
To target an individual, you really need some line of sight, and you'd need to use something like a microwave carrier.
But he says people can be controlled en masse. The question then is, has the government used the technology? Begich says yes. He believes the U.S. sent anxiety signals to get Iraqis to surrender during the Gulf War.
And they said, well, it was because we bombarded them so heavily. That was the American story. You know, look at Dresden, Germany, London during World War II. I mean, that doesn't drive people out.
And most Americans have heard how the CIA has used LSD to control minds. Secretary of Energy O'Leary has acknowledged 500,000 people have been experimented on in some form in the U.S. without their permission. Could it happen again?
We're in the beginning of a new millennium, and believe me, the stuff that's happened in the past is happening again.
Begich says the technology is not extremely advanced. If the military can figure it out, individuals can too. Once that happens, advertisers, politicians, terrorists, anyone could have the ability to control your mind. On special assignment, I'm Ross Blackstone for KOVR 13 News.
Well, Nick Begich has been able to convince the European Parliament to call for a ban in the beginning of treaty dialogue for anything that can manipulate human behavior. Still, the U.S. denies the technology. And if American scientists talk about their work, they will be held for treason. But Begich says many former Soviet scientists who experimented with the technology during the Cold War are now going public because of a lack of funding.
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. We are professing to tell you the complete story that we know. Right. But these records that we've uncovered don't tell the story. They tell pieces of it.
I look at mind control as kind of a more general, informal level of mind control, and then what I call psychiatric mind control. So psychiatric mind control is there's actually a psychiatrist or a doctor right there interacting one-on-one with the person who's the target of the subject. The more kind of general global mind control just works by control of the media, control of information, disinformation, propaganda, and I think our culture basically is run like that. It's very pervasive. The basic gist of behaviorism is Pavlov's dog experiment, where you have the dog that eats its meal and it salivates when you put the meat out. Then when you ring a bell at the same time, the bell gets paired with the salivation. And then what you find, if you condition it enough times, you can just ring the bell and the dog will start to salivate. So that's classical conditioning. There's Skinner and Watson, both experiment on children. Skinner actually on his own daughter had her in a Skinner box for a good chunk of the first 2 years of her life, which was a very enclosed environment. It was actually physically a box. The temperature was controlled. And he thought that was a good way to bring up children and get them to perform exactly the way they should. So it's basically just repeating something and getting it ingrained in the person's psyche. And that basic principle is used in mind control, used in advertising, used all over the place all the time. When you look at the techniques that are used in mind control, a lot of them are pretty low tech, like sensory deprivation, sensory isolation, food deprivation, kind of good cop, bad cop interrogation techniques. We know that hypnosis more or less was used in Greek healing centers, BC. So all these techniques have been around, and I assume that what we have now is the same sort of palette of techniques with a lot of technology and sophistication added on top. Mind control has probably been around for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. It probably was well developed in ancient China. In terms of actual documented mind control, it really begins in the Second World War.
During the Second World War, there was no, in the United States, there was no central coordinating intelligence agency. There's all this fragmented, different branches of the military, and the decision was made to create a central intelligence agency called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which operated till the end of the war. And then there was kind of a 2-year lull period, and then in 1947 the CIA was formed, mostly from prior OSS guys.
The buildings behind me were the headquarters for the World War II Office of Strategic Services. It was here that the first halting steps toward mind control began. The shaper and molder of OSS was General Wild Bill Donovan. In this anything-goes atmosphere, Donovan appointed this man, Stanley Lovell, a Boston industrialist, to break new ground in many scientific and technical fields. He later wrote of his OSS job that it was, quote, to stimulate the PEC's bad boy beneath the surface of every American scientist and to say to him, throw all of your normal law-abiding concepts out of the window. Here's a chance to raise merry hell. It was in this atmosphere that the search for mind control began. It was the Cold War, and especially the trial of Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, who was forced to testify in a Hungarian court that he was a spy. And then later, the Korean War, with the coerced and mainly fraudulent confessions of American servicemen.
My germination took place on the...
That would spark intense interest in intelligence circles about brainwashing.
In this setting, you can get people to do most anything, do you see? Because you don't have to lay a hand on them. And by the time you get through and you go up before the judge, the fellow says, were you a spy? He says, yes, I was a spy. The Chinese never really had this kind of a state police system. They would get him in, and all this fellow does is ask you to write, rewrite, and talk to him about your whole life.
Graduated from pilot training in 1949.
While the purpose of the study was to find out about communist brainwashing techniques, CIA documents show that the agency was interested in developing mind control methods of its own to precondition and control Chinese living in this country to be sent back to their homeland as CIA agents.
The documentation on G.H. Estabrooks, who was a contractor during the Second War, proves that active mind control experimentation was already going on in the 1941 to 1945 time frame. The Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor of the CIA, was studying different types of drugs, interrogation techniques, and G.H. Estabrooks was creating super spies, Manchurian candidates, using hypnosis and other techniques that were used operationally during the war. And the OSS then was shut down at the end of the war, and most of the personnel then became the new CIA in 1947. And the CIA's programs begin in 1950 and run forward to 1973. And then after 1973, everything is classified.
The man who would oversee the CIA's research into drugs and most of the agency's behavior programs is this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. He retired in 1973 and destroyed the records of this work. In sort of a valedictory letter, Dr. Gottlieb wrote that he and his colleagues had been able to maintain contact with the leading edge of developments in the field of biological and chemical control of human behavior. Dr. Gottlieb also testified before the Senate subcommittee, but from an anteroom where he could not be filmed.
Qualifications would be the subject selected to produce the kind of behavior that you wish, the amount of time, the procedures that are utilized, and the motivations of the people who are designing, executing, and administering the procedures. You're asking whether an individual can be, under hypnosis, influenced, coerced, persuaded, shaped to perform an antisocial act, or a destructive act, or an act of violence. My answer would be yes.
This term Jekyll-Hyde personality is used repeatedly by G.H. Estabrooks. He, at various times, did seminars on military uses of hypnosis and creating the super spy on a variety of different military bases. In 1943, in his textbook Hypnotism, and his latest 1971 in an article in a magazine called Science Digest, he describes creating Manchurian candidates, which is artificial multiple personality, just like the Bourne identity, during the Second World War for operational use on contract to the Army. He would create, there's Jones A as the original guy, then he would create Jones B, which he called a Jekyll-Hyde personality. So he used this phrase Jekyll-Hyde personality quite a lot. And an example of an operation would be Jones is called in to see this colonel, and the colonel has been told what the hypnotically implanted code word is. It's the moon is clear. So this guy comes in, he thinks that he's being sent to Tokyo on a routine, unclassified courier assignment. He's given the assignment, and then the military guy in Washington goes, the moon is clear. Jones B comes out The military guy in Washington gives him the classified information, flips him back to his regular self. He flies over to Tokyo. The colonel at the far end says, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you, thank you." That's the above board assignment. The guy at the far end says the moon is clear. Out comes Jones B, gives him the information, the response is inserted, back he goes. And he describes these guys having complete amnesia for the operation and being used operationally in a variety of settings during the Second World War.
The typical way that you hypnotize somebody is you either, you don't actually usually use the swinging wristwatch anymore, but you use kind of relaxation, close your eyes, feet are getting warm, all the way up your legs, hands, whole body's getting warm and relaxed, you're going into a deep, deep sleep. And you're basically getting the person to narrow their attention and focus on you and heighten their suggestibility so that they'll comply with the things you're doing. And you can use hypnosis in a kind of direct, obvious way, where, hello, I'm going to hypnotize you, here's what I'm going to do. Or you can also do it in a kind of indirect, more tricky way the person barely notices. The whole purpose is to focus awareness, put distractions out of your mind, and be more open to suggestions. These mind control programs for creating Manchurian candidates don't just use hypnosis or just LSD or just interrogation techniques. It's a whole lot of different techniques brought to bear for long periods of time. There are experiments in the literature showing, including the CIA documents, showing that you can condition somebody hypnotically and get them to fire a pistol at somebody, believing that the pistol is loaded, and then have no memory for having done that. I don't think it's really about getting people to do what they wouldn't ordinarily do as a spy or as a soldier. It's more about if they're captured and interrogated, it's all hidden behind an amnesia barrier. It's about protecting the assignment. There's specific experiments going back to the Second World War and in the CIA documents in the 50s and 60s to create amnesia. That is, somebody will go in, take papers off of somebody, go in, steal documents, deliver a message, drop off a briefcase. There's a whole bunch of different tasks under hypnotic control and then have no memory afterwards. The Manchurian Candidate, which is the artificial multiple personality, is kind of like the super version of that, where it's not just simple amnesia. There's an actual new person in behind the barrier who carries out the assignment, remembers it, follows all the orders.
So one of the disinformation denial stories that we hear all the time is, we only got into this defensively in reaction to what the communist Chinese were doing during the Korean War. We had our pilots who were captured, they were subjected to some sort of interrogation, brainwashing techniques. They came back home and they made false confessions of germ warfare.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
He discussed 3 different ways to employ germ warfare. Firstly, by dropping germs by themselves, or secondly, by dropping germs with insects, or thirdly, by dropping animals to carry the germs and the insects.
The only other instruction I received, of course, was the order to carry out my germ warfare mission. I know I was wondering myself why on earth we were using this terrible weapon in Korea, even while the peace talks were going on in Kaesong. When my son asked me what I did in Korea, how can I tell him that I came over here and dropped germ bombs on people, destroying and bringing death and destruction? How can I go back and face my family? In a civilized world, how can I tell them these things, that I'm a criminal in the eyes of humanity?
I took part in germ warfare, as far as I know, at the very beginning. At the time I took part in it, germ bombs were referred to as duds.
And then we tried to figure out, how did the communist Chinese get them to make those false confessions? So we're the good guys, and we're only doing that defensively.
Project Bluebird was signed into operation in April 1950 by the director of the CIA, 3 months before the Korean War started. And then it ran for a few years, and then it was rolled over into Artichoke. So Project Bluebird, Project Artichoke are really kind of the same thing. The artichoke team did interrogations on U.S. soil using the so-called artichoke technique. And the artichoke technique involved IV alcohol and drugs, interrogations, safe houses, a variety of different techniques. And the purpose was to try and extract information from a foreign person that was being interrogated. And it also describes erasing memories and implanting false memories that will act as a cover for what really happened. There's a heading in some of the Bluebird documents called The Problem of Disposal of Subjects, what to do with people. And it discusses killing them or the option of using the artichoke technique to erase their memories. MKUltra was part of a series, so it went from Bluebird in 1950 into Artichoke, into MKUltra in the 50s, which ran into the 60s, and then it was rolled over into MK Search, which ran into the early 70s. So it's kind of a continuous series of programs. And MKUltra itself was divided into 149 sub-projects.
There's actually 4 MKUltra sub-projects on children. This is sub-project 103 in 1959, the Children's International Summer Village. The investigator got money through Human Ecology or one of the other front organizations. I think it was Human Ecology. And apparently legitimately didn't know it was CIA money. All these kids are brought there to be at a summer camp. And the academic was studying how kids communicate when they don't share a common language. That was the project. The purpose of the project is to establish a relationship with young foreign nationals who may be of future interest to the agency.
In 1938, Dr. Albert Hoffman in Switzerland was looking for new drugs in the treatment of migraine headaches. He had been studying substances that came from the molds that grow on rye plants. Now, it turned out that these substances were of no use in the treatment of migraine headaches, but subsequent investigation showed that they are very fascinating indeed in the changes that they produce in our mental state.
LSD was invented kind of by accident in the early 1940s at Sandoz Labs in Switzerland. Albert Hoffman was the chemist who kind of stumbled on it and ingested some and went on an LSD trip. The Navy appears to have started LSD experimentation in the late 40s. The CIA got into it starting in 1950. And there was a lot of excitement amongst the contractor doctors for civilian therapy use of LSD that is actually a therapeutic tool.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
The CIA's interest in LSD was intense. The worry was that the Russians would get hold of it.
Were the Soviets into LSD?
I'm going to have to say I'm sure they were, but if you ask me to prove it, I've never seen any direct proof of it.
But at one point, intelligence information received from Switzerland said that Sandoz Laboratories was about to put 100 million doses of LSD on the open market. And it caused enough concern within the agency that the United States was prepared to buy the entire supply.
The CIA was concerned that the Soviet was going to buy up the entire world's supply of LSD from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, which they wanted for their own mind control experimentation interrogation. So they contracted with Eli Lilly Company in 1953 and 1954 for $400,000, which is a lot of money back then, to manufacture and supply a secure quantity of LSD to them. So the first manufacturers and distributors of LSD in North America was Eli Lilly Company. LSD works on the serotonin system in the brain. The first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressant, which works on the serotonin system, was Prozac, manufactured by Eli Lilly Company. So how they developed their expertise in brain serotonin physiology was by being the first manufacturers of LSD.
Lilly has been for a long time really committed to discovering and developing medications to help people with serious mental illnesses, certainly including depression. And Of course, Prozac, which is arguably the world's most widely recognized antidepressant, has been marketed since 1987 and is the drug which, as several people have noted this morning, is the first and the only antidepressant which actually has a labeled indication for the treatment of children who are depressed.
This is a very small quantity of LSD-25, but all investigators report that it is enough to produce a temporary psychotic dissociation state in any healthy adult. The scene which follows shows what happened to Ronnie after he drank the LSD-25 solution.
I'm going to give you this cup that contains lysergic acid 100 micrograms.
I have to maintain my attention. It's an effort to talk to you right now, for instance. Reality.
It seems to feel that I'm going to watch it. You have the feeling that the rock feels that you are watching. Is that correct?
Well, somehow or other, I think that I'd like to rescue myself from the idea that there's so many different realities here. I'd like to find out what reality I'm in.
Does it seem like you've been here a great long time?
I've lost all time perception. Just trying to keep things or true situations, trying to be aware of it, trying to stay in contact with reality.
Have you felt a waxing and waning of reality?
Well, sometimes I've been confused about which is reality and which isn't. I mean, what little situations I was aware of noises, for instance, that may have been to annoy me and may not have been. And rather than investigate, I just sort of let them go.
This feeling comes over me of almost like the singing, of angels or something. I think it's the soundtrack or the film going through the machine.
Look at the picture.
I'm right here.
Do you feel that you're very close to us in your thinking?
No.
Can you tell me anything about your thinking now? Ron?
I seem to wake up to a new world. The same situations, same people and environment, and yet everything, that is my mental state, my life, had been altered. I can't understand.
There's something about this. No more too, man. God, no! No! Get me out of this terrible place! Get me out of here! Help me! Oh, God, help me!
We are continuing our experimental work with hallucinogenic drugs, such as mescaline, cannabis, adrenochrome, etc.
The CIA and the Army and the other branches of the military all kind of operate as a group with a lot of cross communication. So they developed a series of drugs, one of which is called BZ, which is a kind of super LSD where you go on a trip for about 4 days. In the mid-70s at Senate committee hearings, the General Counsel for the Army released a list of about 125 drugs that the Army had tested for mind control.
The Army Chemical Corps next provided the opportunity for exploration of the nervous system with more powerful substances, both in the laboratories and in the field, and for the realization of a strong desire to reversibly reproduce and control derangements at the highest integrative levels, including the mind. A lot of these LSD and other experiments were funded jointly by the CIA, by the Public Health Service, and by the Masons, basically, through the Scottish Rite Foundation. The cutout organizations, the front organizations are called cutouts. The Human Ecology Foundation, which was one of the front organizations through which the CIA funneled money to other investigators who often legitimately didn't know it was CIA money. Well, they were people at obscure institutions like Cornell, McGill, MIT, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, Princeton, Stanford. So these experiments at top secret clearance level were done at basically all the major teaching institutions in the United States.
Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain. The chief researcher was Dr. Russell Monroe, now head of the psychiatry department at the University of Maryland.
Was this patient aware that she was being given LSD?
Yes, I mean, they were told that they would be given some medication, and they should have...
Specifically LSD?
Well, we told them, I don't think that they would have even known what LSD was then at the time. They were told that they were going to they would be given some medications which might make them feel worse. They were looking for an incapacitating agent, an agent that would not harm the person permanently, but would incapacitate them temporarily. That seemed like a humanistic way to wage a war, if war is necessary.
Back in the days when I first came here, there was a famous therapy program that operated in Oak Ridge for over a decade. And this program specifically targeted and tried to help serious mentally disordered offenders, people who'd done very serious and terrible crimes. The goal of the program was to try to help these people understand their own behavior, their own motivations, their own background, in an attempt to try to help them avoid that kind of violent behavior in the future. And it was a very radical program in the sense that it used techniques that had not really ever been tried before. The program, for example, used a lot of what we called in those days defense-disrupting therapies. This defense-disrupting therapy, for example, would have people involved in these very long-term group therapy sessions. They might last, 48 hours, with people not sleeping. The idea, of course, here was that by depriving people of sleep for these kinds of periods of time, their defenses and their masks, if you want, would be lowered, and people would be able to reveal and understand each other's deeper inner selves. They also used some defense-disrupting drugs, most famously LSD, but more commonly they used things like scopolamine or even alcohol to try to get this mask or this outer self peeled away so that the participants in the program would be able to more clearly understand themselves and each other. It was quite fascinating to me and to my colleagues that this program had been going on for such a long time, was so highly regarded, and it was still going on when I first came here in the 70s.
The most chilling experiments we have uncovered took place at this Gothic estate called Ravens Crag, halfway up Mount Royal in Montreal. It houses the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry of McGill University. It was here that the CIA funded a series of experiments, severe experiments. The work was done by the Institute's then director, Dr. Ewan Cameron. It is the closest experimentation to brainwashing yet disclosed. His work, unprecedented in psychiatry, consisted of 3 areas which he called sleep therapy, psychic driving, and the ultimate depatterning.
In his psychic driving, so-called type of therapy, he would give the patient intensive electric treatment in order to make the patient regress deeply, become forgetful, and then he would attempt to implant new ideas in the mind of the patient.
Now, to a layman, it would appear that Dr. Cameron was trying to take the slate and wipe it clean, the slate being the mind. In other words, brainwashing.
Exactly, that's a very good comparison.
Brainwashing.
Yes.
The next step was what he called psychic driving. This involved almost endless tape-recorded messages and more drugs for the patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct controlled changes in personality. The most severe technique Cameron used was depatterning. He described it as breaking up the existing patterns of behavior by means of intensive electroshock therapy with prolonged periods of sleep. He carried out these experiments in something he called the sleep rooms. Cameron used this combined sleep electroshock treatment on patients as long as 30 days. One patient he kept asleep for 65 days.
Ewan Cameron at McGill, who was a direct MKUltra contractor, who basically erased people's memories and identities with massive amounts of electric shock, and then played thousands of times over tape loops to try and build up a new personality. And he was successful in the sense that in documented cases where I have the medical records, a person has complete amnesia for age 25 back to birth, and it was all totally wiped out on contract to either the CIA or the Canadian government on purpose at McGill in our lifetimes.
9 people sued the CIA for the experimentation done on them in McGill by Ewan Cameron under funding from the CIA, and the CIA settled out of court. Normally, when you do ECT, you push the button and there's a zzz, electricity goes through your brain, and that's it. That's one dose of ECT. In the Page-Russell technique, the button is pushed 6 times. There's 6 times the energy. So this is the equivalent of over 600 electric shock treatments delivered between May and September. And Ewan Cameron published this in mainstream leading journals, and he called it depatterning. It's totally business as usual, nothing out of the ordinary going on. And it'll say, blood pressure such and such, patient incompetent of stool and feces. Patient disoriented times 3, which means she doesn't know who she is, she doesn't know where she is, and she doesn't know what the year is because she's been depatterned. She literally couldn't control her bowels or bladder, didn't know her own name, didn't recognize her husband or her children, wiped out. Because the idea is you're trying to wipe out that old mental illness, and then after you've done the depatterning, you want to create a new personality. And the way we did that was psychic driving. Psychic driving involved playing 2 tape loops for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, either in the doctor's voice or the patient's voice, saying, you love your mother, or you're a good citizen, or whatever it might be. And there would be weeks of barbiturate and other medication-induced sleep, and sometimes he would throw in some hallucinogens. This was just a guy trying to learn how to help patients. Except it was funded by the CIA. Why is the CIA interested in depatterning? Well, when you read the Artichoke and Bluebird documents, they discuss this, they discuss that. One of the topics of discussion is the problem of disposal of subjects. And then they discuss in there, what are we going to do with these people? How are we going to get rid of them? And we can't just kill them all. But one thing we can do is wipe out their memories. So this was obviously contracted to figure out how to wipe out people's memories, and why an intelligence agency would be interested in that is extremely obvious. Ewan Cameron was at various times head of the Quebec Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the World Psychiatric Association, of which he was one of the co-founders, and the Society for Biological Psychiatry. The Society for Biological Psychiatry held numerous meetings and conferences and published the proceedings with and without direct funding by the CIA.
Ewan Cameron, who was a civilian psychiatrist, very politically involved in world psychiatry, became part of the US team that went over to Nuremberg and interrogated the Nazi doctors. While he was over there, he heard about uses of mescaline and hallucinogens in the death camps. Then he came back and did hallucinogen experiments in Montreal. So he literally learned about that from the Nazi doctors. Also, the Nuremberg trials, as we know, gave rise to the Nuremberg Code, which is basically an updating of the Hippocratic Oath, saying that subjects have to give informed consent, they have to be protected, they have to know the nature of the research, it can't be excessively harmful, and so on. But his own experiments violated all of those principles.
And now what we're talking about is not the bad stuff, the mild stuff that they declassified. This is the tip of the iceberg.
The ultimate goal of these projects is just your basic interrogation. We want to extract information from people, and then on top of that, we might want to induce amnesia for the whole interrogation. Or offensively, we want to have people who if they're captured and they're interrogated, they won't confess because the information is all hidden behind an amnesia barrier.
1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and the study was basically 400 black, illiterate guys in rural Alabama with syphilis were actively denied treatment for 40 years of follow-up. At the 25-year point of the study, the Surgeon General of the United States signed a certificate. They all got a signed certificate and $25, 1 year for every year of participation in the study. 400 guys for 40 years engaged in how many acts of intercourse and fathered how many children with congenital syphilis, none of which could be identified or treated? I mean, it's literally Nazi death camp level ethical violations.
Pedophiles will commonly tell, if it's the person's daughter, this is our special secret, this is how daddies show love. It's so special we shouldn't talk about it. But actually, of course, they know perfectly well that it's a crime and they don't want to get caught. So it's the same thing with the CIA doctors. They know that it's so outrageous to say, hi, I'm being funded by the CIA. They're trying to figure out how to interrogate people and wipe out memories. Would you mind participating in an experiment where I can help teach the CIA how to do that? It'll never get approved by the ethics committee. No patient will ever consent to it. So they have to consciously, deliberately cover it up.
The effort to cover it up is just kind of saying, oh, it's a funny coincidence, reporting it in the mainstream media. Everybody kind of goes, well, that's good, what's on TV tonight? And it just kind of passes by. And that's kind of the way the cover-up of all this mind control experimentation worked. It's not that it didn't happen, it was published in all these mainstream journals. And at the bottom of the papers, it often says, funded by Department of the Army, funded by U.S. Office of Naval Research, funded by Air Force Office of Scientific Research. It never says funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. But we know that just from reading the journals that it's military funded at a minimum. And I think that the mainstream media is just more and more and more and more of a propaganda arm and less and less independent all the time. 80%, in Gallup surveys, 80% of people in the United States do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So only 20% of people have bought that story. I mean, we just live in a whole culture of fake stories. A woman comes to the emergency department claiming that her boss at her university made her sit in a room entirely lined with leaves and gave her a bunch of LSD, and she's had a bad trip and now she's in the emergency department. This is the Ames Leaf Room, called the Ames Leaf Room because it was designed by Dr. Ames on contract to the Office of Naval Research. It's basically a box that's got leaves glued to all the walls, and it's open at this end. You can look into it. The subject is sitting in the Ames Leaf Room, and he's got two knobs that he can move to adjust that white bar that's at the far end of the room. And he's got it adjusted so it appears to be perfectly horizontal to him. While he's in the Ames Leaf Room, he's wearing these goggles that have special lenses called anisoconic lenses that distort all the angles so that nothing seems to meet up properly. It's all out of perspective, doesn't make any sense. And he's high on LSD, funded by the Air Force. So as a result of this experimentation, Dr. Marazzi was able to determine that if you sit in a leaf room wearing lenses and you're high on LSD, you can't see straight. This is incarcerated sex offenders are the experimental subjects here. The psychiatrists involved all are former military psychiatrists, documented fact, and they're cleared at top secret under the MKUltra contract. And what they do is they give these guys LSD, marijuana, barbiturates, and they interview them, aka interrogate them. And the purpose of the project is to try and get them to confess to sex crimes that they've never been charged with. And the purpose of that is because you want to see if you can give this concoction of different techniques to an enemy agent or some person of interest, will they confess to something that they wouldn't otherwise have confessed to?
Intelligence is nothing really other than information and knowledge. For the days of Socrates, by various methods, and even before that, mankind has been seeking knowledge of everything that influences his own life or the life of the nation to which he belongs. But the idea that it is necessarily nefarious, it's always engaged in overthrowing governments, that's false. At no time has the CIA engaged in any political activity or any intelligence activity that was not approved at the highest level. The KGB is one of the most sinister organizations that ever was organized.
Do we have an application of morality in our activities they don't?
Oh, far more than they do, yes.
Could you talk on that subject?
Well, only that, as far as I know, we don't engage in assassinations and kidnappings and things of that kind. As far as I know, we never have. As far as we know, they have, and done it quite consistently. Given the caliber of the men and women I had working for me, I didn't want to ask them to do a thing that I wouldn't do.
In my position in the CIA, I had a chance to know of and remotely to observe many operations. And I will not deny that there were occasions when the Americans involved in these, as it were, out on the front, had, as people do in wartime, to undertake actions that were contrary to their moral precepts. You can't take on operations of this, covert operations, or covert for that matter, of this scope, draw narrow boundaries of policy around them, and be absolutely sure that those boundaries will never be overstepped.
I can assure you that the CIA, when I was there as director, and I'm quite sure it's the same with Mr. McCone, has given these committees full information about what it's doing, how it's spending its money, and how it operates.
We've had some statements from those who are supposed to receive this testimony that they really don't know and don't want to know what the CIA is doing.
When I appeared before them again and again, I've been stopped by members of the Congress and said, "We don't want to hear about that. We might talk in our sleep. Don't tell us this."
What in the world were they looking for with the magic mushrooms?
I think the best answer to that is that they were looking for fundamental information on compounds that would be capable of causing changes in behavior, changes in mental attitude.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you... I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
The best-known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program.
Frank Olson was working at Fort Detrick, which is the basically chemical warfare center of the Army, where Amedeo Marazzi worked, who was the Ames leaf room guy. And he was directly involved in LSD and other experiments. It looks like he was just about on the edge of becoming a whistleblower. And so he went to a party attended by Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of MKUltra, who ran MKUltra, where he was slipped a dose of LSD and some Cointreau liqueur, went on a bad trip, came home, was all bent out of shape, was taken to see this guy Lashbrook, who's an allergist in Washington, who just happens to be CIA contractor and LSD expert on the side. And they try and kind of help him out, and then he jumps out the window of the Statler Hotel from the 10th or 12th floor, dies. But actually, it's entirely a cover story. almost virtually for certain he was pushed. Frank Olson's family read this, said, wait a minute, that's our dad. We didn't know this is tied into LSD experimentation. They got on the government, and Carter personally met with them and gave them like $750,000 settlement.
Frank Olson's suicide slowed down the CIA's testing of LSD and other drugs, but only momentarily. The CIA was not the only government agency interested in the possibilities LSD and other drugs presented for mind control. The Army Chemical Corps first started working with the CIA and then branched off on its own. It too tested drugs on unwitting victims, and a death would result. The case of this man, Harold Blower, a tennis pro, seen here with his daughter Elizabeth, is well known. In 1953, Blower was a private patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was given 5 injections of a mescaline derivative that was being tested secretly for the Army Chemical Corps. With the 5th injection, Harold Blower died. As with the Olson case, a 22-year cover-up followed, until finally the Army admitted the real details of Blower's death. Thornwell was an Army private stationed in Orléans, France. Classified documents were missing from his unit. Thornwell became a suspect. His 2.5-month interrogation included administration of sodium pentothal, hypnosis, isolation, and deprivation of sleep. Despite this severe questioning, Army intelligence was getting nowhere with Thornwell, and it was decided to slip him LSD. For 16 years, Thornwell never knew what had hit him.
Tell me about the acid. I'd rather not. It's a bad trip. It's a bad trip. That was a bad trip. The pain was so excruciating. Felt like somebody was sticking me with 1,000,000 pins. You know, just everywhere. Oh, it just...
From the Army's point of view, this type of LSD interrogation was a success. Other documents refer to the exploitability of interrogation subjects, cracking them, keeping them off balance mentally, and providing an economical, speedy, and productive aid to interrogation. This bizarre man would be an active participant in that search over the next 2 decades. His name is George White, an OSS captain who had formerly been with the Bureau of Narcotics. He received his early OSS training at the British-run school at Oshawa, Canada, the same school where Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was trained. White referred to the school in his diaries as the Oshawa School of Mayhem and Murder. George White worked with the Truth Drug Committee here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the nation's capital. They experimented with mescaline, scopolamine, and marijuana on unwitting victims. The committee soon learned there was no easy panacea, no truth drug at this stage. But White and later colleagues would not stop trying. The goal remained the same. As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. While the existence of these safe houses was disclosed last year, details of what took place within them has not been told. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
George White hired prostitutes to go to bars and pick guys up, bring them back to the safe house, have sex with them and slip them LSD without their knowing it, and the CIA guys would make scientific observations of this through the one-way mirror. And it says in the documents, the purpose of this is to study the effects of an unwitting dose of LSD under conditions that mimic a field interrogation. Just down at the bottom it says, it's a lot more difficult than you would think to create these Jekyll-Hyde personalities. So Jekyll-Hyde personalities equals multiple personality equals the Manchurian candidate. So why is there a comment about the difficulty of creating Jekyll-Hyde personalities when there's only one contact with each of the Johns? He has sex and he gives LSD. You can't possibly be creating a new identity in that guy. So the only possible person you could be creating a new identity in is the prostitute. These are Manchurian Candidate prostitutes who were being run through simulations to see whether they could turn a trick and attempt to extract information from the guy, and maybe LSD would help with that. These are unwitting civilians, haven't given informed consent, don't know they're getting LSD, and there's no follow-up. How did they go off the rails? Did they have fun? Did they go home? What happened? No idea whatsoever. Absolute and total violation of medical ethics. And there's doctors under MKUltra and MKSearch directly involved in this experimentation.
In terms of the Manchurian Candidate, the idea is to use hypnosis, drugs, fear, terror to split off part of the mind. And then you can get control of that part of the mind separately, and that part of the mind can carry out missions. You could use sexual torture, you could use witnessing torture of others, you could use physical torture, mental torture. There's really no limit to it. Louis Jolyon West is known as Jolly West because he's a very jolly guy, I assume. Top secret cleared MKUltra contractor. One of his greatest accomplishments was killing an elephant at Oklahoma City Zoo with a dose of LSD. Louis Jolyon West, Martin Orne, Margaret Singer, and Robert Lifton were expert witnesses at the Patty Hearst trial. She's in her apartment with her boyfriend Stephen Weed when the Symbionese Liberation Army storms in, guns literally blazing, there's gunfire. Her boyfriend Stephen Weed's knocked out with a rifle butt. She's put in the trunk of the car, taken away to the Symbionese Liberation Army safe house, where she's kept in a closet for 45 days. There's mock FBI raids during which she thinks she'll be killed at any time. She's raped in the closet, extreme sensory deprivation, sensory isolation. She then subsequently participates in a bank robbery under the name of Tanya and is photographed during the bank robbery. There was a murderer in Dallas, so they called him in to examine the murderer, whose name was Jack Ruby. Now flash forward to the 1995s, Timothy McVeigh's arrested for the Oklahoma City bombing, taken to Tinker Air Force Base where he alleges that a computer chip was removed from his buttocks, and a psychiatrist has brought in Louis Jolyon West. He was involved in the UCLA Violence Project, which was actually approved by Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California, but shut down by public protest before it actually became operational. And they were going to take sex offenders, put electrodes in their brain, and there would be both a tracking electrode and an immobilization electrode, basically. So they would track these guys when they were released from prison. If they went outside a restricted area, a signal would be sent to their brain, immobilizing them, and the police would come pick them up. Going back to the 50s, in the CIA military documents, and also in the general psychiatric and medical literature, there's very clear descriptions of putting electrodes in people's brains and then stimulating those electrodes with radio waves from a remote transmitter box and controlling the person's behavior, dramatic changes in behavior and mental state. Now we're at brain electrode experiments at Tulane. Robert Heath, what he did is he put electrodes in this gay guy's brain, who was 19 years old, and he studied his brain electrical activity, and then he hooked him up to a little belt. So I've got a little belt here. On his belt, he had a button in a box, and he could push the button because the wire went from the box to the electrode into his brain, and bring himself to kind of a pre-orgasmic state. So they had to take the box away from him because he pushed the button 1,500 times in 3 hours. They had him watch heterosexual pornography over and over and over and over while in a pre-orgasmic state to try and condition him to become straight. Jose Delgado, you can actually find him on YouTube. You can see the video where he's in the bull ring with the bull that comes charging at him. The bull's got electrodes in his brain. He pushes the box and the bull just goes over there.
Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research. In this experiment, the bull is sedated. Electrodes are implanted in its brain. Delgado transmits an electronic impulse to the center of the bull's brain. Delgado has remote control of the animal. Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man.
This is his book, Physical Control of the Mind. We need a program of psychosurgery and political control of our society. The purpose is physical control of the mind. Everyone who deviates from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain. Someday, armies and generals will be controlled by electrical stimulation of the brain. This is a Yale professor of neurosurgery. He literally wanted electrodes in every brain in the population. The controlling elite would be so small, even the generals would have electrodes in their brains.
No doubt, like everything else, it's become more miniaturized, more computer sophisticated, and probably can be controlled from satellites now, I would assume. There's documents going again back into the 50s under MKUltra showing using either sound waves or electromagnetic waves that you can knock monkeys out, knock human beings out, make them disoriented.
Unwitting civilians have been exposed to hypnosis, LSD, chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. We know that these non-lethal weapons exist, that they can affect your mental state, your behavior, they can cause pain, they can cause confusion, they can knock you out. What are the odds that those weapons have never been tested on unwitting civilians? I say zero.
On the one hand, it's sort of you can't do anything is the problem, because if somebody's beaming, this electromagnetic weapons at you from a satellite or from an aircraft, how are you going to know it's happening? How are you going to prove it's happening? And how are you ever going to get them to stop? It's impossible. On the other hand, I think that by far the best way to protect freedom and democracy is think critically, don't buy everything, research it, and be aware that you're subject to an awful lot of propaganda.
We lack the trained men who would be able to plan and implement operations in an area we think is vitally important. Because of this, we are also requesting that your team of advisors include a senior officer who is thoroughly experienced in psychological operations.
The PSYOP tools are radio, television, leaflets, newspapers, loudspeakers, and face-to-face communication. PSYOP is now a major weapon in 20th century warfare.
I say that mind control is kind of at two levels. There's general mind control, which would include propaganda, disinformation, spinning things in the media and so on. The level of mind control I'm interested in I call psychiatric mind control, where there's an actual doctor in a one-to-one relationship with the person. And I'm interested in that because it's a gigantic violation of professional ethics. So at Abu Ghraib and at Guantanamo Bay, we've got psychiatric level mind control going on.
We see it very clearly in the light of day in both Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, where all the components of Bluebird, Artichoke, MKUltra are still in operation currently. Sensory deprivation, sensory isolation, hooding, doing frightening mock killings, good cop, bad cop interrogations, waterboarding, sexual humiliation, cultural humiliation, electric shocks. All these things are being used for a fact currently. Trauma-based mind control is, the basic idea is, part of the interrogation technique is you frighten the person tremendously. And this happens and is reported by people who are captured in the Middle East and held. It also goes on at Guantanamo Bay, where you threaten them with death. You're going to execute them now. You take them out to be shot, but the guns never go off.
There's behavioral science consultation teams at Guantanamo Bay that are psychologists who go in there and run the interrogation programs, run the psychological part of it. And there's physicians consulting to this because you don't want to push the guy, unless you do want him to die, you don't want to push him too far because he might die. And the techniques that we know are used are hooding, sitting in very stressful positions like crouched down against the wall for prolonged periods, sensory deprivation, sensory isolation, some degree of beatings, waterboarding. We know that there's sexual humiliation, There's humiliating their culture, the Quran, and their religious beliefs. There's forcing them to do sexual acts with each other. Female military officers come in and come on to them sexually, aggravate them sexually. These are the techniques of mind control. There's not just one thing that you do. I've heard many people say they were in Monarch, and I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with all the branches of the military, Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, and all of them said they had nothing on Project Monarch.
I've met both Mark Phillips and Kathy O'Brien, and they're both extremely pleasant people. They seem very genuine. I don't think they're making things up. It's not some kind of a publicity scam at all. Whether every single detail of her story is actually historically accurate, I'd say somewhat doubtful.
It's like something from a Hollywood horror movie. A hospital where patients are given massive doses of drugs like LSD, intensive shock therapy, put to sleep for months at a time.
I was reduced to a baby and wearing diapers and being fed, and you know, I can't imagine it. I don't remember that, thank goodness, because it would haunt me in my dreams.
But at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, the nightmare was all too real. And incredibly, what happened there was secretly supported by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the Canadian government.
It just doesn't make sense that you can take a mother away from her children and ruin her life, and that other people won't be affected too.
I'm Bob McEwen. On this Fifth Estate, we investigate what the Government of Canada kept hidden for decades and what they're still trying to hide. It was 1964, and 5-year-old Diane McIntosh couldn't wait when her father said they were going for a drive to visit her mother, who was in the hospital.
My dad used to let me sit on his knee and steer the car, and so that was play.
On each visit, their car would turn onto the long drive leading through the hospital grounds to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, a psychiatric facility with the best reputation in the country. More than half a century later, Diane still remembers what she saw then, as if it were yesterday. Because when they got to the hospital door, her enthusiasm turned to horror.
When we got there, the place was just like a scene from One Flew Out of the Cuckoo's Nest. There were people banging their heads on the walls and droning, and my mother was sitting there completely drugged up. And even as a child, I knew that she wasn't right.
What they didn't know at the time was that her mother, Hélène McIntosh, and hundreds of others like her were unwitting guinea pigs in brutal psychiatric experiments that took place at the Allen Institute under the code name MK Ultra. Massive drug regimens, enforced prolonged sleep, intensive electroshock, largely funded by the Canadian government and the American CIA. No consent was ever asked from the patients, and no explanation of the experiments was ever given to them. The MK Ultra brainwashing project got its start in the early days of the Cold War, when some Canadian and American soldiers returning from the conflict in Korea expressed sympathy for their communist enemies. At a time of paranoia about the so-called Red Menace, the Americans believed the Soviets and Chinese might well have devised an effective brainwashing method, and the CIA was determined to crack it, as ex-CIA officer John Gittinger told the Fifth Estate in 1980.
So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
But the CIA knew it could be politically difficult to fund brainwashing directly, so it set up a front company to do it, euphemistically called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology.
These are the days and hours are the occasion.
And they found a prominent scholar doing related research in Montreal, the renowned psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, co-founder of the World Psychiatric Association. Those who worked with Cameron called him domineering, and more.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
And it is his mind, no less, which may destroy mankind.
Over the years, in addition to CIA funding, Dr. Cameron received Canadian government research grants worth well over $4 million today for experiments on what was called psychic driving and depatterning, attempts to erase negative memories from the human mind and replace them with new, positive ones. So it was that in 1962, a 23-year-old mother of two, Hélène McIntosh, was referred to Ewan Cameron for what she thought would be a time out from the pressures of motherhood and marriage.
They promised me that I would get rested. I was told that I would be looked after in the hospital.
Depressed after the birth of her second child, her GP recommended Dr. Cameron. No one told her she would be part of a radical science project with a full menu of experimental treatments, shock, drugs like LSD, months of induced sleep with recordings bombarding her subconscious 24/7. After all that, Hélène McIntosh says she effectively became an infant again.
That was hell. It really was. It's something that you can't describe. And when I start talking about it, I start shaking. My body shakes. It's like my body's saying, don't go there.
Today, Hélène has only a few scattered memories of her years at the Allen.
Electroshock and a picture of Dr. Cameron, but I do remember him. I remember his voice very clearly.
What do you remember about it?
He sat me in front of a group of medical students or doctors that were doing their residency, and he said, this woman is hopelessly incurable, and that was it. And he was so cold.
But through all of that, her young daughter Diane, raised by grandparents, lived for those special times when her mother got the chance to spend a few hours with her girls.
I remember when she was able to come out for a visit, and she would be able to come over and tuck me in at my granny's place, and I would just lie there immobile after she left. And when Granny would come in to say goodnight, I'd say, don't touch the covers, don't touch the covers, don't change it, because Mom left it this way. And I'd try to sleep all night without moving the covers.
In all, Hélène McIntosh spent 2 years at the Allen Institute. Most of her memories erased like data on a hard drive.
That's you.
Yeah.
Look how dark my hair is. I don't think that's...
Today, at home in British Columbia, much of the McIntosh family album is a mystery to Hélène. Now it's Diane who must guide her mom through the images of the past she no longer remembers.
There's Carolyn. So they're not in order.
That's me.
That's you, of course.
It is clear that in different ways, both McIntoshes are victims of that secret brainwashing project in Montreal, and they are far from alone. Hundreds of victims passed through these doors in the 1950s and 60s, all with their own horror stories.
I feel like I've been completely used. I feel like my mind has been completely invaded.
Had to be toilet trained. I was a vegetable. I had no identity, I had no memory, I'd never existed in the world before.
I had lost all
just
my
like a baby.
in myself. I suffered like hell. My mother had to stay with me all the time. She couldn't leave me 1 hour.
5 decades later, the Government of Canada has been more deeply involved in all this than it wants to admit, with new secret settlements, shutting down lawsuits and gag orders. And as you'll see after the break, it is not something they want you to know about.
The government doesn't seem to do anything. They don't recognize you. It's wrong. It's shameful.
From 1950 until the mid-60s, Montreal's respected psychiatric facility, the Allen Memorial Institute, was the site of secret brainwashing experiments, funded by the CIA under the codename MKUltra, with money from the Canadian government as well. The program would quietly be shut down in 1965. But the truth about what happened there would be protected for another decade and a half longer. Then, in 1980, we were among the first to tell Canadians about it.
The Fifth Estate.
I'm Adrienne Clarkson. Tonight we report on a secret CIA research project carried out in Montreal in which mental patients felt they were used as the CIA's guinea pigs.
They kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks.
And the Fifth Estate stayed on the story for years to come. From then to now, many of the key questions have remained the same.
The Fifth Estate.
So why was Ottawa so ambiguous when it came to helping some Canadian citizens get compensation from Washington for what they endured in a program that was inspired mostly by American Cold War fears? Well, the answer was simple. The government of Canada was even more deeply involved in the Allen Memorial experiments than the Americans.
Get away!
Hold him!
After word of the experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute came out, the CBC broadcast a drama entitled The Sleep Room about Dr. Ewan Cameron's mind control treatments. In the absence of visual evidence inside the hospital, it is as close as we can come to how it looked and sounded.
Driving doesn't work. Can you admit that now? You destroyed these people for nothing! You can't just walk away from this, Cameron! It'll come back and it'll ruin you!
Many of them were just sitting there like zombies, and I have a headache. I don't remember anything.
Gina Blasbalg was 15 and in an orphanage when she was sent to the Allen. She got massive drug doses and was kept asleep for months. Fortunately, she never received electroshock therapy, which may explain why she remembers the real Dr. Cameron and his patients.
How did those patients regard, or apparently regard, Dr. Cameron?
Those patients were too far gone. The ones that were not too far gone were terrified of him. We were all terrified to see him around. We didn't want to be near him. I don't think that any patient ever wanted to be close to Dr. Cameron.
When news of Cameron's experiments was revealed, 9 of the Canadian victims filed a lawsuit against the Central Intelligence Agency, alleging they had been unwittingly used in research that was medically improper, even illegal. Plaintiff Velma Orlico of Winnipeg didn't think they stood a chance.
I've often, when I've been alone at home, thought, how can you fight the CIA? Who in heck do you think you are? How can you fight the CIA?
But eventually, in the late 80s, David got a concession from Goliath. The CIA settled with the Canadian patients for about $90,000 apiece. A moral victory, at least. And a few years after that, in the 90s, the Government of Canada announced its own compensation plan. But only for the most seriously injured victims, those who survived the experiments in a childlike state. The government also insisted it had no legal or moral obligation to do it. To many, that system seemed designed not to distribute compensation, but to discourage it. In the end, only 80 of the patients subjected to the brutal psychiatric experiments were approved for federal compensation. Another 250 were denied. And who knows how many more never even knew the compensation program existed. So when the application deadline came and went, and it was too late to apply, the government's secret brainwashing program simply faded into the past. Or did it? The government deadline expired 23 years ago, and the majority of survivors had already passed away, when a few weeks back, CBC News reporter Elizabeth Thompson was poring over government financial records. Buried deep within those 2017 public accounts was an item about a mysterious payment linked to those brainwashing experiments years ago.
It talked about, compensation for someone who had been depatterned at the Allen Memorial Institute.
Name withheld, it said. No other information about the victim was available. But with some digging, Elizabeth Thompson would learn the Trudeau government had prevented the victim's family from ever discussing the settlement. Thompson discovered the name withheld was that of Alison Steele. She's the daughter of Jean Steele, who arrived at the Allen Institute in 1957 with a severe case of postpartum depression. Today, Alison Steele still can't discuss the settlement, but she can talk about her mother. She says she effectively was raised without a mom after Jean became a Cameron patient, and the years of drugs, sleep therapy, and electroshock.
It's erasing your memory. I mean, how dare they do that to a human being? How dare they do that to a human being?
According to Alison, the result was that when Jean eventually returned home, behind her lovely smile, she was intellectually and emotionally absent, her marriage and family relationships irretrievably broken. Alison's family had been trying to get compensation and failing for decades. In 1993, Alison's father's application was officially denied in writing after the government wouldn't give him the hospital records he needed to prove his wife had been medically tortured.
I have a big thick file of all his handwritten letters back and forth to the government, stating all of the treatments that, all of the things that had happened to her, but we didn't have the main file.
And then the years went by. First, Alison's mother Jean died, and her father passed away at 93, his quest to have the federal government do what's right for victims like Jean still unfulfilled. But 2 years ago, a breakthrough. Alison made an official request for her mother's full medical file under the Access to Information Act. And this time, incredibly, a package arrived in the mail.
So I waited, and sure enough, about a month later, I received a manila envelope with about 300 pages, legal size, double-sided, of all of the bedside notes.
In the basement chest in Knowlton, Quebec, where she stores those records, is a mine of information that the government had kept to itself for decades. Notes her father could have used years ago to prove what happened to her mother. Among those newly discovered notes, some written by Ewan Cameron himself. Alison's mother Jean is described as overactive, overtalkative, distractible, very suspicious, showing inappropriate behavior, and crying for no reason. Those adjectives certainly could describe someone no longer mature enough to be a mother because of Dr. Cameron's depatterning. And other notes from Cameron and colleagues clearly state that Jean Steele had at least 24 intensive electroshock sessions and might require weekly shock treatments for the next 2 to 5 years, seemingly indicating a very serious condition.
Now, these are the files your dad never saw.
He never saw those files.
Your father never got that kind of material.
No, he didn't. Well, I guess it was his word against the government's word.
How do you think he would feel about you and this?
Oh, he would be proud as punch. He would be proud as punch of me. I know he would. Oh, yeah. He would be very happy.
When Alison Steele took those new medical documents to her lawyer, Alan Stein, he immediately launched a court action against the federal government. He says the Steele family finally had the proof they'd always needed.
There's no question about it. The her medical history and medical report confirms this.
You talk to Alison, she says, that took my mother away. She had no capacity to be a mature parent after that.
That's right. And I've seen that. I've seen medical reports from many, many other former patients of Dr. Cameron who were denied compensation, and the same thing happened to them.
And ultimately, the federal government would agree to pay compensation in her mother's name, on the condition neither she nor her lawyer ever talk about it in public.
What does that tell us about the mindset of the current government, that this should be something they insist upon?
Because they don't want more applications. They don't want to have to deal with more applications. If this went to court, it would have more publicity and more applications would be forthcoming.
Now, in accepting your settlement, you were required to have a non-disclosure agreement.
Correct.
You couldn't talk about the settlement itself.
No.
Let me ask you about what that represents. Is that not apparently a way for the government to limit the number of people who learn about this, who might be entitled to something like this themselves?
Well, it seems to be something because...
Why else would they do it?
Why they're still covering it up? Why are they still covering it up? Maybe they won't if they hear about this. You know, maybe they will try to realize and recognize what the government did before, and maybe there's still hope that they could at least recognize these victims.
And lawyer Alan Stein says it's now time for the Government of Canada to finally admit the role it played in those brutal experiments.
The government never acknowledged that it was responsible for the experiments carried out by Dr. Cameron, and which experiments the Government of Canada funded. There was no question that the Government of Canada funded these experiments.
Do you believe that responsibility should be taken?
I definitely believe it.
The years of silence haven't been easy for the victims. For survivor Ellen McIntosh and her oldest daughter Diane, it's taken years to be able to discuss it all with one another. Diane was only 3 when her mother entered the Allen Institute, and Ellen knows too well that Diane and the other girls have been profoundly affected by what happened to her.
I just hope that I know she's forgiven me for, I don't think she's ever held it against me. When she was on the phone, all she said was, "I love you so much, I love you so much." And I know she does, you know.
I'm still dealing with this and still struggling with it. There have been negative ramifications in my life and that have prevented me from being happy and from being productive at many times.
Ellen McIntosh was one of the lucky ones who got a hard-fought settlement from the government in the 1990s, but she says for her it was about a lot more than that.
I got the compensation, but for me it wasn't the money, it was the validation that I received, that I wasn't totally crazy, you know, that I was treated the way I was, and it made me do crazy things, but I didn't go in there crazy.
Not having our mom was not great, but if you remind her of that, it hurts her too much, you know. And I just have to say, it wasn't you, it was them.
It is now the better part of 7 decades since the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal became that house of horrors. Today, perhaps hundreds of Canadians, survivors and family members, are still paying the price for the brainwashing experiments sponsored by the Canadian and American governments. Yet to this day, neither the U.S. nor Canada has ever said we're sorry.
I'm Adrienne Clarkson. Tonight we report on a secret CIA research project carried out in Montreal in which mental patients felt they were used as the CIA's guinea pigs.
They kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks.
The CIA was interested in Dr. Cameron's work on psychic driving because it could give them an idea of where the personality could break or be stressed.
Those of us who were involved with trying to find out something about brainwashing, yes, this is the reason that we were interested in Dr. Cameron's work.
The The American Central Intelligence Agency has been accused of manipulating citizens of countries all over the world, including Canada. At the moment, a number of Canadians are considering suing the CIA. They believe they are victims of covert CIA experiments. Tonight, two Canadians who feel the past 20 years of their lives were damaged by the CIA tell their stories publicly for the first time. They believe they were part of a CIA project called MKUltra, a research project so secret that even the Canadian government was not informed that the agency was funding activities in this country. The CIA was seeking a new weapon, aimed not at the body, but at the mind. Americans became obsessed with brainwashing during the Korean War. Prisoners of war returned home denouncing the American way of life. Hearing them parroting propaganda, the CIA became convinced the communists had found the key to brainwashing. Now the Americans had to unlock the mystery of mind control.
There was great worry that the Soviets had developed rather esoteric and unusual methods of so-called brainwashing people. The purge trials.
Dr. John Gittinger was the CIA's chief psychologist for 25 years.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
Nothing seemed too bizarre. To find out if sex could be used in spying, the agency studied San Francisco prostitutes and their clients. Using unwitting human beings as their guinea pigs, the agency tried everything: drugs, hypnosis, electroshock. Under code names like MKUltra, the CIA spent 25 years and $25 million on secret mind control research. Brainwashing could be a powerful ideological weapon, and the U.S. had to have it. And when the agency didn't undertake its own studies, it funded someone else's. Thus, the search for mind control brought MKUltra to Canada, to Montreal. Even in the Cold War years of the late 50s and early 60s, most doctors and academics would have been embarrassed to have found that an organization of spies was openly paying for their research. So the CIA set up a number of fronts, respectable foundations like the Human Ecology Fund. Sounds innocent enough, but it was run by the CIA's brainwashing experts. Here at McGill University in Montreal, the fund found 3 projects worth financing. They supported an extensive study of witch doctors in Nigeria. How, investigators wondered, did native healers cure mental illness? What mysterious drugs and potions did they use?
Device used to bind up excited patients. A sleeping potion is then administered.
20 years ago, the Human Ecology Fund paid for this movie.
This soothes the patient's head.
But it was only recently that the man who made the film found out that he had been working with the CIA's money. The author of the Nigerian study is still at McGill University. News of his connection to the CIA came as quite a surprise to Dr. Raymond Prince.
I couldn't imagine why the CIA would be interested in my work in looking at indigenous healers in West Africa. That seemed really strange. That was my first reaction, and I couldn't believe that, I couldn't understand how the CIA would be interested in that.
Because there were all kinds of beliefs that African witch doctors could put the hex on people. But anybody who makes a systematic study of what are the psychological factors that can produce anything from having a person run amok in Indonesia or die of the sickness from a witch doctor in Africa would certainly add to all of the knowledge that we were being able to accumulate about behavioral science techniques.
The Human Ecology Fund also helped set up the Transcultural Psychiatric Research Review. Edited at McGill, the journal continues to publish without CIA support. The largest MKUltra research project, this one directly related to brainwashing, was carried out at the university's psychiatric hospital, the Allen Memorial Institute. Located atop Mount Royal in a mansion with the eerie name of Ravenscrag, the Allen Memorial was once the most prestigious mental hospital in Canada. The unorthodox treatments of its director caught the attention of the CIA in the mid-50s. Dr. Ewan Cameron, the first director of the Allen Memorial, ran the institute with an iron hand for 20 years. But Dr. Cameron remained an American citizen and left the Allen abruptly in 1964. He returned to the United States, where he died in 1967. An energetic, enigmatic man, Cameron was an internationally honored and respected psychiatrist, but he was not universally liked. Former colleague, Dr. Elliot Emanuel.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
Much of Cameron's research went on in the stables next to the main hospital building. Here he had his subjects photographed before and after treatment. Dr. Cameron may not have known that the $60,000 research grant he received from the Human Ecology Fund really came from the CIA.
Rudolf Hess.
Nonetheless, it now seems ironic to some that Cameron was called to the Nuremberg trials to examine Rudolf Hess. For it was at Nuremberg, after Nazi doctors who experimented on prisoners of war were condemned, that a code of scientific ethics was adopted. Research must be completely safe, and research subjects must give full, voluntary consent. Documents recently released by the CIA reveal what research Cameron proposed. To make patients receptive to repetitive messages, Cameron suggested using chemical agents to break down ongoing patterns of behavior, chemical agents like LSD. LSD was almost unknown in the late 50s and not yet widely tested. Despite the horrible hallucinations small doses can produce, Dr. Cameron left some of his patients to unsupervised LSD trips. In 1956, Bob Logie was 18 years old when his severe leg pains were diagnosed as psychosomatic, and he was sent to the Allen Memorial Institute. When Bob heard the news reports of CIA-funded research at the Allen, he sent for his medical records. They revealed several doses of LSD. Today, Bob Logie lives and works in Vancouver, but he's still angry.
I feel like I've been completely used. I feel like my mind has been completely invaded. I suppose if guinea pigs have feelings, they'd feel like I do.
LSD trips were terrifying to patients who had never heard of LSD and who had no way of knowing why their world was suddenly upside down. Hallucinations last for hours. Experts say this is what an acid trip would look like if it could be filmed.
LSD was really horrifying, very horrifying, and they gave it to me for about 12 or 15 times. One minute I would see the doctor there, the next minute I wouldn't see him there, and they were asking me all kinds of questions, and I remember them telling me that I was getting smaller and smaller, and I really felt myself getting smaller. And they were bringing me back in time, way back, At one point, I almost felt like I was just about to be born, really, that far back in memory. And they were really, really probing, asking all kinds of questions. And I felt I didn't have any control. I had to answer. I didn't feel I had any control. I was completely, like they had complete control over me.
Bob's leg pains were eventually treated with cortisone, but the effects of the LSD stayed with him, and soon he was back in the hospital.
I just felt I couldn't cope. I couldn't adjust after the LSD, and I was having a hard time. I couldn't hold down a job for very long. I was going from one place to another, and the anxiety really built up. I just couldn't cope, and I went back.
The interest in this sort of chemical, this kind of magic, this shortcut weapon, prompted the CIA's interest in hallucinogens, particularly LSD?
Very definitely, because the first pressure was being placed on the idea that there was some kind of truth serum or truth drug or something on that. So the people who knew that end of the business, they were definitely beginning to look in terms of chemotherapy. And of course, to people in this day and age, it's very hard to believe that the period before 1960 was a period which was certainly not a chemical culture in this country and not a drug culture in any sense of the word.
With some patients, Dr. Cameron tried a drastic treatment called depatterning. Massive doses of electroshock, 20 times more intense than the standard shock treatments used today, were administered to patients who were kept sleeping for days. Dr. Cameron thought he could wipe out patients' sick behavior and leave the healthy personality intact. But first patients were to be so depatterned that some even forgot their toilet training. Not all the patients ever completely regained their memories. Dr. Peter Roper was a close colleague of Dr. Cameron's at the Allen.
Many people, but some would reach what Cameron would call the third stage of depatterning. With that method, others would need 2 treatments a day, maybe for a week or longer, before they got to the third stage.
What would characterize the third stage of depatterning?
Well, the third stage, as defined by Cameron, was a loss of ability to orientate themselves. They knew who they were, but they didn't know where they were, and they didn't know what age they were.
As you probably know, electroshock treatment has been given for depression for something like 40 years now. It's a very successful and useful treatment for severe depression that doesn't respond to other things. But depatterning is a use of electroshock treatment in a totally different way, in which instead of giving the shocks, say, 2 or 3 times a week, they're given 2 or 3 times a day for 3 or 4 weeks, reducing the patient to a sort of animal, vegetable state, from which it's hoped that they would recover in a more healthy state of mind. It didn't work.
To put patients to sleep for up to a month at a time, Dr. Cameron used a combination of depatterning and large doses of drugs. Individual taped messages were repeated to sleeping patients 15 hours a day in an effort to brainwash them back to health. Now, Cameron reasoned, with their negative memories obliterated, positive suggestions could be implanted. Suggestions like, begin to assert yourself, express your anger. Dr. Cameron called his technique psychic driving. Bob Logie had driving therapy when he returned to the Allen in 1959.
I was there for a while, and I thought, I don't want to stay here, and I started to run away from the hospital, and they grabbed me, and then they put me on sleep treatment. And they kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks and playing tapes just over and over. I don't know what was on the tapes yet, but we're going to find out what was on the tapes through hypnosis.
The CIA was interested in Dr. Cameron's work on psychic driving because it could give them an idea of where the personality could break or be stressed.
Those of us who were involved with trying to find out something about brainwashing, yes, this is the reason that we were interested in Dr. Cameron's work.
Patients came to the Allen Memorial Institute from all across Canada. Dr. Ewan Cameron, it was said, would give them the best psychiatric care money could buy. But some of the patients had no idea that a lot of their treatment, the LSD, the massive doses of electric shock, the sleep therapy, was highly experimental.
When I was in the hospital in '59, my husband, that's when he told me he thought they were killing me, because he said it was every day, and there's a special treatment which he doesn't know. I think there was some sleep. I was always asleep. He used to call the hospital. I couldn't have any visitors for 3 weeks, you see. Hilda Bernstein was at the Allen Memorial in 1959 as Dr. Cameron's patient.
She's convinced that the sleep treatment she received was depatterning. Her memory remains severely damaged. Mrs. Bernstein was an English war bride. She and her Canadian husband went to Montreal in 1945 to raise their family. After a nervous breakdown, she was hospitalized at the Allen.
It's 3 weeks that was out of my life as far as I'm concerned, because I can't remember anything about it. I didn't know my husband and my children, my brother-in-law and his wife. And my sister-in-law at that time, when she saw me, she cried. My brother-in-law told me this when she saw me. She's a registered nurse too, and she said she'd never seen such a change in a person in 3 weeks. But I looked really dreadful. I still can't remember my aunt being with us. I look at the pictures that we took when she was here. We took her to the New York, and we were at the museum there. I look at the pictures and I still can't remember her being with us. And she was with me for 3 months. And this aunt was my mother's sister, who was very near and dear to me.
Dr. Emanuel thinks Cameron's use of extensive electroshock, depatterning, was somewhat unethical.
The quantity, the frequency, the intensity, and the sort of animal state to which it reduced the patients.
What you're really saying is that the doctor knows that by doing it that much to somebody, there's going to be an effect? Is that...
Indeed. And with little promise of cure. Hope, but as it turned out, it wasn't, and it didn't become an accepted psychiatric treatment.
So many patients were left with some amnesia after depatterning that the Allens stopped the treatment when you and Cameron left. Under the new director, Cameron's disciples would come to regret their enthusiastic use of depatterning. Dr. Peter Roper left the Allen Memorial in 1967.
What were the circumstances of your leaving the Allen?
Somewhat questionable.
In what way?
The annual reappointment was not renewed in 67.
Did Dr. Cameron have anything to do with this, or was after he left?
Oh, that was after he left. He left in 64.
Did you have any disagreement about treatments given there?
I didn't disagree with anybody. I think there was the depatterning treatment was stopped, I think, in 65. So anybody that continued to do it after Cameron left didn't do it after 1965.
So you didn't do it after 65?
Oh, no.
I certainly know that an intelligent, ethical scientist today would not do an awful lot of things that an ethical scientist would do in those days.
How do you now feel about the use of involuntary subjects for CIA experiments or CIA-funded agency experiments?
I certainly think that it would be ridiculous in this day and age. No, I don't see any way that you would do that.
There was no informed consent. I would guess that, as I've just said, informed consent, as we now know it, was not a part of research at that time, and especially as regards the use of LSD, perhaps, or the depatterning, I doubt if those patients really knew what they were being led into.
Informed consent doesn't mean much to people who are mentally ill.
Not many people are so mentally disturbed that they can't understand that they're being given an experimental drug, or they're being given electroshock 3 times a day. People can understand that. It can be explained in simple words.
It had a great effect on my life. I mean, I have been sick before, and I've had treatment, but there were never any experience I had was like that I had in 59.
I've never been able to sleep without medication since the sleep treatment. I went through years and years and years of severe depressions. I dream about it. All my waking hours I think about it. It's It's eating me up. It really is.
I mean, if he was doing it and knew what he was doing for the benefit of the CIA, then I don't agree with this at all. I mean, why pick on me or anybody else? I don't like that.
It leaves me completely stunned. I don't know if I'll ever recover from it.
Good evening. I'm Eric Malling. 9 Canadians who were the unwitting victims of CIA brainwashing experiments are suing the United States government. But so far, the Canadian government has done nothing to help them.
If I were in charge of a government to whom 9 citizens that we are suing for have been brainwashed without their knowing, have had their lives impaired, and have it done by a foreign agency, undercover without the government of Canada knowing it, I would find a way to help those people instead of hindering them.
Four years ago, there were some startling revelations about the activities of the CIA in Canada. The American intelligence agency had paid for a series of brainwashing experiments under a project codenamed MKUltra. The tests were conducted in secret in the United States and in Canada at a mental hospital attached to McGill University. Experimental drugs, including LSD, were administered to human guinea pigs. The patients were never told that their treatment was part of a CIA experiment. 9 Canadians are now suing the U.S. government for $1 million apiece. They charge that their lives were disrupted forever as a result of the brainwashing. Despite the fact that the CIA operated secretly in Canada to fund these medical experiments on Canadian citizens, the federal government in Ottawa has joined hands with the government in Washington to hold back vital information which might at last reveal all the sordid details.
In Winnipeg, Val Orlico spends a lot of time tending her plants. It's one of the few hobbies she has left. She used to devour books and write long letters. Now she can't concentrate on a book for more than a single page, and writing a letter is beyond her. She's on medication 24 hours a day. If she wasn't married to David Orlico, an NDP member of Parliament, she might never have learned the full story of what happened to her.
That's very good. I better get out the tomatoes and the green pepper and...
In 1956, suffering from depression after childbirth, Mrs. Orlico was referred by her Winnipeg doctor to a top psychiatrist in Montreal. Unknowingly, she was about to become part of a cruel CIA experiment, codenamed MKUltra. In Langley, Virginia, outside of Washington, stands the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, protected by walls of secrecy as high as the trees. Stored inside computers like this one is what's left of the CIA files on the MKUltra project. Convinced the Soviets and Chinese had perfected brainwashing during the Korean War, the agency sought to perfect its own techniques, both to protect its agents and to use as a weapon.
Who did you meet with in the safe house?
The CIA man overseeing the project was John Gittinger.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
In Montreal, on the side of the mountain overlooking the city, stands an ancestral home bearing a name worthy of an Edgar Allan Poe horror tale, Ravenscraig. Donated to McGill, Ravenscraig became the Allen Memorial Institute for the Treatment of Mental Illness. Here the CIA channeled money for MKUltra, Subproject 68, which became a real-life horror tale. The project chief in Montreal was Dr. Ewan Cameron, world-renowned chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at McGill and director of the Allen Memorial Institute.
The CIA secretly funded the medical experiments through a front in New York City called, of all things, the Society for the Protection of Human Ecology. Documents show that the agency had been impressed with earlier work done at McGill in sensory deprivation, work that was useful in designing sophisticated torture techniques later on. But at the time, brainwashing looked even more promising, and Dr. Cameron was the perfect one to carry out the work. An American citizen with a world-class reputation, operating outside of the United States. Dr. Cameron certainly had the credentials. At various times, president of the Canadian, the American, and even the World Psychiatric Association.
These are the days and hours are the occasions.
In an address to colleagues from around the world, Cameron showed that he certainly knew the potential of the human mind, for good and bad.
And it is his mind, no less, which may destroy mankind.
Val Orlico came to the Allen for her postpartum depression.
Everybody in the hospital was very much in awe of Dr. Cameron, and he strode the halls like a giant. And people would say, oh, there but for God goes God. And to me, I thought, how could he possibly ever take me for a patient? Who am I? I mean, this great man who's done all these marvelous things. And boy, I better work hard, and I better do everything that he tells me to do. And, you know, I don't want to lose this opportunity to get well.
Like Mrs. Orlico, Mrs. Janine Huard of Montreal came to Dr. Cameron depressed after childbirth. The depression was made worse by a hearing problem that coincided with the birth of her child. She, too, was in awe of Dr. Cameron.
He was a very, very impressive man. And I was told he was the best doctor in North America. So he would look at you a few minutes, ask you a few questions, and then proceed with the treatments.
But I never saw him once in all the times that I saw him that I wasn't afraid. Every time I went down to his office, I would shake with fear. And every time I'd see him coming down the hall, I'd shake with fear. But I adored him.
Dr. Elliot Emanuel knew Cameron.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
At Ravenscraig, Dr. Cameron went further with drugs and electric shock treatments than any of the U.S. researchers in the MK Ultra project dared. His aim was to wipe the mind clean. Then he would implant new messages by forcing the patient to listen to a hypnotic repetition as many as 250,000 times. This was called psychic driving. Most of the drugs used in the program were experimental, and some dangerous. There was the tranquilizer Artane, a paralysis-inducing anectine, and curare, which pygmies tipped their arrows with to paralyze victims. Bulbocapnine, another experimental tranquilizer, and lysergic acid diethylmide, the hallucinogen LSD. In her room at Ravenscraig, Mrs. Orlico waited for her first treatment.
Well, I saw a tray with hypodermic, with a needle, a syringe, and the card on it had my name, so I looked a little more closely, and it was lysergic acid diethylamide. And my husband was a druggist, and I knew a lot of drugs, but I'd never heard of that one. And so I phoned a friend, and who was a psychiatric nurse, and I said, do you know what it is? And she said, I never heard of it. But she had a friend who was a psychiatrist, so she phoned her friend, and she called me back, and she said, he said that this stuff causes poisonous psychosis. She said he said not to take it. Well, I thought, you know, he's a very Freudian psychiatrist and doesn't believe in any medication of any kind. And after all, here's Dr. Cameron. I mean, he's the big doctor, and he's, you know, he's known all over the world, and he wouldn't do anything that would harm me, etc. And so I took the injection, but I didn't like it. And it really did create a poisonous psychosis.
LSD, with all its frightening mental images, was scarcely known at the time. But the CIA secretly brought some in from Switzerland, where it had just been developed.
The room became very distorted, and I thought my bones were all melting. And I just wanted to scream that I wanted to get out of there. And I saw the squirrels outside, and I thought, they're not the squirrels, I'm the squirrel. I'm in this cage, and I can't get out. And I started to throw myself from side to side in the room. And I couldn't write. They had given me a pencil and paper and asked me to write down, but I couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't focus. I don't know, it was like some kind of funny hell I'd fallen into, and I couldn't get out. And I don't know how long that went on. It was just a terrible nightmare. And I just felt that my life was threatened. I could never go back to what I'd been.
Robert Logie of Vancouver was 18 when he came to the Allen complaining of trembling and severe leg pains, diagnosed as psychosomatic. Like Mrs. Orlico and Mrs. Huard, he had no inkling he was to be part of a CIA experiment.
The LSD was very horrifying, and they gave it to me for about 12 or 15 times. One minute I would see the doctor there, the next minute I wouldn't see him there, and they were asking me all kinds of questions, and I remember them telling me that I was getting smaller and smaller, and I really felt myself getting smaller. And they were bringing me back in time, way back, At one point I almost felt like I was just about to be born, really, that far back in memory. And they were really, really probing, asking all kinds of questions, and I felt I didn't have any control. I had to answer. I didn't feel I had any control. I was completely, like they had complete control over me.
Mrs. Huard, like the others, was forced to pay for the so-called treatment, massive electric shocks, and all the drugs.
They would give me as much as 40 pills a day. And I would ask the nurse, what is that? They would say it's a new drug, and they only name it by a number.
What did all those drugs do to you? How did they make
Well,
you feel?
I was very, very strong, well-powered. So these drugs kind of desensitized me. They would lower my reactions. They would lower my resistance.
As well as the experimental drugs and massive electric shock treatments, Mrs. Huard was subjected to psychic driving. Hypnotic-like messages were repeated over and over to a sleeping patient, sometimes for as long as 16 hours in a row. They were a key part of the mind control experiment. This is how Mrs. Huard remembers one of the messages.
Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why, Janine? Why? Janine, why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away?
I would try very strongly not to let my mind be capturing all the messages, but they would lower my resistance so much with the heavy drugs, but I couldn't do otherwise than listen.
Did you ever ask them how any of this was making you better?
No, I didn't ask questions. I was just say, I don't want to go through it again. And I would cry. I didn't want it, I knew it. Way down in my heart, I knew it wasn't good. But, how could you fight? You're in a hospital where it's supposed to be the best, with the best doctors. So, what can you do?
I'd say, I can't take it anymore. I can't stand it. I don't think this is doing me any good. I feel worse. And he'd walk down the hall a little way with me and put his arm on my shoulder. And come on now, lassie, you know you're going to do it. And finally I'd say, well, okay. And off we'd go to my room, and he would give me another injection and then pat me on the shoulder, and off he'd be again. I had LSD, I believe, a total of 14 times. And sometimes there would be 4 days between the injections, and sometimes there would be one consecutive day after the other. And some of them I managed to write down things in my notes to Dr. Cameron.
A newly declassified CIA document shows there was at least one voice of protest at the agency as the experiments got underway. One agent wrote, "Does Project Officer approve these immoral and inhuman tests? I suggest that all who are in favor of the above intended operation volunteer their heads for use in Dr. So-and-so's noble project." The names were deleted. In her hospital room, a terrified Mrs. Orlico tried to hide like a child at the sound of Dr. Cameron's approaching footsteps.
I heard him coming, and I hid in the washroom in my room. And I thought, well, I'll go and sit on the toilet and nobody will see me. Anyhow, that didn't work because he knocked on the door and he said, "Now, come on, Lassie, you know you're in there, and come on, you come out and let me give you your injection." And I said, "No, I'm not taking any more injections. I can't do it. I don't care if I die. I can't do it anymore because this is killing me, and that's all there is to it. I can't do it." Well, he wasn't very happy about it. And however, after a little discussion, he turned on his heel and left the room.
The electric shock treatments were administered on an unprecedented scale. It was called de-patterning. The mind was short-circuited so the psychic driving hypnotic messages could be planted on a clean slate. There is now no known use of electric shocks on such a scale, even in Soviet mental asylums where political crimes are punished. Psychiatrist and former colleague of Dr. Cameron, Dr. Elliot Emanuel.
As you probably know, electroshock treatment has been given for depression for something like 40 years now. It's a very successful and useful treatment for severe depression that doesn't respond to other things. But de-patterning is a use of electroshock treatment in a totally different way, in which instead of giving the shocks, say, 2 or 3 times a week, they're given 2 or 3 times a day for 3 or 4 weeks, reducing the patient to a sort of animal, vegetable state, from which it's hoped that they would recover in a more healthy state of mind. It didn't work.
I was there for a while, and I thought, I don't want to stay here, and I started to run away from the hospital, and they grabbed me, and then they put me on sleep treatment. And they kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks and playing tapes.
There was another lady who had the same kind of psychic driving that I did, and she was a very wiry, slender lady, and with lots of pep and zip, you know, and she'd go to the dances and this and that. And one day she just wasn't there. And when we asked where she went, they said, "Oh, well, you know, she's gone to another hospital." Well, sometime later, I was in the day hospital, and I happened to ask a nurse if she'd heard what had happened to this lady. And she said, "Oh, that's her sitting over there." And I looked, and there was a fat lady that just looked like she was made out of dough. She didn't know me. She didn't know herself. She didn't know anybody. She was gone. Now that's a death.
Did you ever try and get away from there? Did you ever say, "I'm just not going back"?
I tried. I was home for the weekend, and I had a pass for the weekend. That's how they call it. So when I was there, I said, "I'm not going back there." So I telephoned, or somebody else in the house telephoned, and they said, "If you're not coming back, we're sending the police after you." So I remember being so upset. I was crying. I didn't want to go in. And it was really like a concentration camp.
There was a gentleman who jumped off the roof of the Allen. I don't think he had LSD, but he had sleep therapy with psychic driving, you know, with the driving tapes under his pillow, and they told him he was going to go home, and he'd just come out of sleep therapy, and he just jumped. He said, went around, big smile on his face, said goodbye to everybody, went up on the roof and jumped off and landed at the back door of the Atlan, which was a dreadful, awful thing. I don't think he was more than 30. And he was just gone. Just gone. And there was this big washed area at the back door. Nobody would go in and out of that back door for a long time. And everybody in the hospital spoke in hushed tones, and everybody was affected. They would not talk about it. It was as though it did not happen.
In 1973, all MK Ultra files under the control of the Technical Services Division chief of the CIA were ordered destroyed by the director, Richard Helms. But in a bureaucracy as vast as the Central Intelligence Agency, it's difficult to destroy everything. And the damning evidence of the Cameron Project surfaced after a Freedom of Information Act suit. It revealed Mrs. Orlico had reason for her nightmares and her doubts.
I've heard that it was the most brutal program under MK Ultra in the States and in Canada, that this was the most brutal. It was an awful feeling to realize when I found this out that the man whom I had thought cared about what happened to me didn't give a damn. I was a fly, just a fly.
Her husband, David Orlico, NDP Member of Parliament for 22 years, remembers the cost.
We had Blue Cross coverage, but we didn't have, but Blue Cross did not cover treatment in a mental hospital. So what we did after the first year was to sell the house, which was really the only money that we had. And my daughter and I moved in with Al's mother. And we stayed there almost 3 years. It was tough, but the financial cost was really a small part of the cost. If you're talking about cost, it really disrupted our lives.
Mrs. Orlico sued the Allen Memorial Institute, and last year it quietly settled out of court for $50,000. But that's only the amount she estimates she had to pay for what she thought was treatment. Apart from giving Mrs. Orlico her money back, the Allen has done nothing to compensate Cameron's other victims. But in the U.S., a former CIA director, Stansfield Turner, promised the Congress the agency would try and track down victims of the MK Ultra project in both Canada and the U.S. so they might get compensation. The CIA wrote the Allen this recently declassified letter. Addressed to Maurice Danger, then director, it said, "It has been our understanding that there are no remaining records of Dr. Cameron's research that might reveal the identities of patients under his care during the time period in question. However, by way of leaving no stone unturned, we now inquire whether this information might be reconstituted through patient records, financial records, or other hospital records. Sincerely yours, Daniel B. Silver, General Counsel, CIA." So even the CIA made some effort to find the victims, but little help from Montreal.
There is no record of the Allen ever attempting a search of all its medical records, although Cameron's successor admits it would be easy enough to do. CIA documents show that 53 people in Montreal were subjected to the MK Ultra experiments, but only 9 of those have been positively identified. Apart from Orlico, Huard, and Logie, there were 3 Montreal housewives, one of whom is now institutionalized. There's a Montreal businessman who never really got his life together again after the experiments, and another man who's been destitute for most of the time since. Ironically enough, one of the victims is now a psychiatrist practicing in Eastern Ontario. She obviously functions well enough, but after the experiments, 10 years of her memory was wiped right out.
The McGill project was abruptly terminated in 1964, and so Dr. Cameron returned to the United States. 3 years later, he died suddenly of a heart attack. Subsequent evaluation of Cameron's work in Montreal by his successor showed that the intensive shock therapy was not only medically useless, but potentially dangerous. Cameron, though, never revealed how much he knew about the CIA sponsorship of his work. Robert Logie was later given cortisone treatment for the pains in his leg that brought him to the Allen in the first place. It worked, but his mind is a different story. He now has joined with Mrs. Orlico, Madame Huard, and 6 other Canadians in a massive lawsuit against the United States government. They contend that they sought treatment and instead were made unwitting victims of CIA experiments. The 9 Canadians are seeking $1 million apiece in damages from the U.S. government. The CIA intimidates many American law firms, but this case is being fought by a lawyer who defended Lillian Hellman and Arthur Miller during the McCarthy witch hunts for communists. In preparation, the lawyers have interrogated every CIA agent involved in MK Ultra, including former director Helms. With the trial expected to start soon, Joseph Raw sums up the case with his junior partner, James Turner.
What we get out of Gittinger?
John Gittinger is the former CIA staff agent who testified that at his request, the CIA contacted Cameron and informed him that a front in New York would support his work. As a result of that, Cameron received CIA funds to finance the LSD and brainwashing experiment.
In other words, Cameron, all he did was what the CIA was in effect asking him to do.
Yeah.
And what he said he was going to do, and he did it. And
then they paid him money for it.
And then what about Gottlieb now? We got a lot of stuff out of Gottlieb. Here's one of his depositions. We got him, I take it. He said, I'm going to wash my hands of this. I approve the project, but I don't have to take care of the Canadian citizens who are going to be affected. Is that fair?
That's fair. He admitted that they took no steps whatsoever to guarantee that people wouldn't be injured if it could be avoided, or to make sure that people even knew that they were participating in an experiment.
Well, this guy Gottlieb's got quite a record, doesn't he, on negligent action ahead of time. I mean, before this ever...
He was personally involved in an experiment that resulted in the death of a U.S. Army...
Is that the one where they put the LSD in the Cointreau of a guy named Olson?
Yeah, and then he jumped out of a window and committed suicide in New York City. They managed to cover that up, too.
I like a man who was general counsel of the CIA. His name's Larry Houston. And at that time, he said this was culpable negligence. He was a general counsel. And they went on, left a guy on the job who had been guilty, according to their own lawyer, of culpable negligence. What about Helms? We took his deposition, too. It's right here.
Yeah, it's an awful thick deposition. He didn't remember a whole lot. There's a major case of forget-me-nots. The only thing that we really got out of him was that he instructed Gottlieb, the CIA's Dr. Gottlieb, to destroy the records.
When the story broke about the covert CIA activities on Canadian soil, the United States sent a formal apology to the Trudeau government. But External Affairs Minister Alan McEachern has refused to release that document to Mrs. Orlico and the others in the lawsuit. This declassified State Department letter shows why. Addressed to the Canadian Embassy, it reads, "This is with reference to your request for the views of the U.S. intelligence community concerning possible release by the Canadian government of certain documents relating to the Orlico matter. Your request was given careful review, on the basis of which it has been requested that the Canadian government withhold from public disclosure the documents in question."
We moved heaven and earth to get the correspondence and the documents and the discussions between the Canadian government and the United States. The United States won't give it to us because they're covering up their wrong. The Canadian government won't give it to us because they're scared of the United States government. Both of them are holding back all of the information about this. I think the case could be broken if the Canadian government would say to the CIA, we're not going to cover up for you any longer. We're going to allow this, we're going to give this material to Mr. Orlico for his case.
Well, if the Canadian government has this apology from the U.S., why in the world do you think they wouldn't release it?
Oh, I just think the Canadian government's a little bit like international wimps in the case of the United States. I don't know why they're so scared of us. We're not going to do anything. I don't think the 7th Army is going to attack Montreal because you give us that material.
I understand, though, that the American position is that this kind of CIA material can't be released for national security reasons. Maybe that's true.
Well, security, my neck. First, the CIA, everything they forget. Then when they have to stop forgetting, because it's ludicrous, then they say it's all national security. What is national security about the apologies of the United States to Canada? They get very belligerent, the Canadians, with the Russians when they shoot down the 007 with some Canadian citizens. But when the CIA covertly does something to all the citizens, ruined the lives of many of these citizens, well, the Canadian government's doing nothing. I don't know why.
Canada made forceful representations on behalf of the Toronto businessman who was kidnapped by bounty hunters taken back to Florida. That wouldn't indicate that they're afraid to make a ruckus down here.
That was a pretty easy situation. I mean, my God, you kidnap a Canadian, take him to the United States, heavens above. And furthermore, who do you have to fight there? A couple of bounty hunters. Here you're fighting the CIA. That scares Canada.
I'm surprised that if your case is as strong as you say, that the American government isn't trying to get an out-of-court settlement, pay out a bunch of money, and just hope it'll go away.
When the CIA went into this brainwashing stuff, what they call the MK Ultra program, when they went into that, they injured lots more people than the 9 we are suing for. They injured a great many other people.
Here in the United States?
Here in the United States. They may feel that they've got so many skeletons in their closet that settling with us, even though we're clearly right and they would like it to go away, would hurt them as a precedent. I can't think of any other reason that they're being so really rough on us.
I think there is a duty on the government to release, in a matter such as this, all of the information it has.
Alan Lawrence is the conservative justice critic in the Commons.
There's been government complicity or government negligence, so be it, you know. It's far better to make a full disclosure and a full confession of your sins in a matter such as this. It's always a difficult thing for anybody to sue a government or sue an agency of a government. And if you don't have the cooperation of your own government in doing it, you have a few strikes against you right off the bat. If the process was reversed, if it was some sort of a secretive Canadian operation taking place in the United States, I'm sure all hell would break loose down there as far as beating of breasts and waving of flags and whatnot.
If the material came from the States, perhaps they're bound by, if not law, good manners to not turn it over if the source of the information doesn't want it turned over.
I don't know about manners. I don't know about international manners very much. But I know this. If I were in charge of a government to whom 9 citizens that we are suing for have been brainwashed without their knowing, have had their lives impaired, and have it done by a foreign agency, undercover without the government of Canada knowing it, I would find a way to help those people instead of hindering them.
We tried to ask External Affairs Minister McKechnie why the government of Canada is not helping these Canadian citizens who are victimized by agents of another country. But for more than 2 months, Mr. McKechnie has been unavailable to discuss the matter.
What do you want to tell Mr. McKechnie, for example, about what happened to you? How you feel about it now?
I would tell him to try what we've been through and see what he would have to say after. Because only when you go through such an experience, one can say how bad it can be and how painful.
I'd say, come on, get off your horse and help us. We need some help from our government. We are innocent victims of something that happened that should never have been. And you can't make it. You can't put us back where we were. But at least do something to help us now. Do something to stand up and say this can't happen in Canada.
What can you possibly get for your clients out of this case?
You can't get their health back. That's not possible. And they're older people, and some of them may die during this stonewalling by the CIA. And some of them may get worse. One of them, at least, is in an institution now. I mean, the thing is very much needing of speed by the to get recommended. You can get some money. That's all you can get. That's all you can get when a doctor misoperates on you. You don't get your health back. There's no way we can get their health back. But what we can get them is some funds to help ameliorate their old age with the damage that's been done to them by this lousy performance that occurred through the CIA by Dr. Cameron mistreating them and hurting them.
One thing which triggered Mrs. Huard's initial depression was growing deafness in one ear. That was later corrected with minor surgery. But no surgery can undo Dr. Cameron's work at Ravenscraig.
I cannot go to sleep without any medication. I have migraine headaches that last for a week at the time. Doctors cannot find the cause. I have slight amnesia. I have a lot of trouble to concentrate.
I've never been able to sleep without medication since the sleep treatment. I went through years and years and years of severe depressions. I dream about it. All my waking hours I think about it. It's eating me up.
I've been hospitalized. When I first went home to Winnipeg, I attempted to take my own life because I couldn't endure the way I felt. And I have a chronic need. I'm very dependent on other people. And I have a chronic depression, which at times gets worse.
Not being with my family, not being able to follow a career, not being able to study anymore, which I wanted to do very much. I would say it cost me my life.
This is the story of a 30-year search by U.S. intelligence agencies to perfect mind control. Some of those engaged in that search have agreed to talk about it for the first time. One said, "I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line." The search would be endless. From brothels, an agent says, we learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom, to the mystical rites of a magical mushroom ceremony performed by an Indian shaman, to a Spanish bull ring. The bull has had electrodes implanted in the brain and is controlled by a scientist. There would be victims. One intelligence agency tried to peel this man's mind back to reveal its deepest secrets.
I'll live through it. I'll live through it.
This man worked on some of these programs. He would write of his work, "It was fun, fun, fun." This is the story of the search for mind control.
ABC News Close-Up, Mission Mind Control. With ABC News correspondent Paul Altmaier.
1217, now boarding at 8.
Mark? Anne. It's been ages.
Can I buy you?
Allow me. 2 Michelob Lights.
Michelob makes a light beer? Perfect.
The good taste of Michelob Light. Don't just compare it to other light beers. Compare it to your regular beer. It's that good.
You always did go first class.
Your ticket to San Francisco. Thank you.
San Francisco?
You too?
Good taste runs in the family.
Mrs. Cooper, I need help. Oh. With all these different dog foods, I don't know what kind to feed him. Dry, soft.
Honey, it's not the form, it's the formula. Those are for any dog, young, old, whatever. But Cycle 2 dog food
is especially for dogs ages 1 to 7, like mine.
The Cycle 2 formula has just what dogs in their active years need to help stay healthy.
And happy.
With Cycle, I know what to feed him.
Now get Cycle 2 in 25-pound bags.
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. We are professing to tell you the complete story that we know. Right. But these records that we've uncovered don't tell the story. They tell pieces of it.
This is a story that has been told in bits and pieces. This is an attempt to pull most of it together. We know we don't have the full story. We do, however, have some striking new revelations and insights. The story begins here, just off the nation's front yard, the Mall. The buildings behind me were the headquarters for the World War II Office of Strategic Services. It was here that the first halting steps toward mind control began. The shaper and molder of OSS was General Wild Bill Donovan. He said of his group's work, "We may have made mistakes, but we were not afraid to try things that were never done before." In this anything-goes atmosphere, Donovan appointed this man, Stanley Lovell, a Boston industrialist, to break new ground in many scientific and technical fields. Donovan called Lovell his Dr. Moriarty, after the fiendish professor in Sherlock Holmes. Lovell liked the name and posed for this Saturday Evening Post photo. He later wrote of his OSS job that it was, quote, to stimulate the Peck's bad boy beneath the surface of every American scientist and to say to him, throw all of your normal law-abiding concepts out of the window. Here's a chance to raise merry hell. It was in this atmosphere that the search for mind control began. This bizarre man would be an active participant in that search over the next 2 decades. His name is George White, an OSS captain who had formerly been with the Bureau of Narcotics. In his diary, seen here publicly for the first time, White left a legacy of the darker side of American intelligence work. He received his early OSS training at the British-run school at Oshawa, Canada, the same school where Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was trained. White referred to the school in his diaries as the Oshawa School of Mayhem and Murder. Mike Burke, former OSS colleague of White's and now president of Madison Square Garden Center.
Very compelling fellow, mysterious fellow, almost mystical fellow. He was fascinating because you knew something about him, but not enough about him to really get a fix on him. He also knew a great deal about the swifter elements of society, the gamier side of life, and he was very impressive in his technical knowledge of the underworld, so to speak.
He said one of our men gets beat up. He says you have to act real fast and teach these guys a lesson.
Charles Siragusa, a former narcotics officer and friend of White's.
He'll come around, he says, and break your kneecaps. And with that, one guy laughed, and George would always have little Billy with him. And this one guy sort of naked. George White turned around and whapped him across the neck with it. Then he picked up a pool stick and started beating everybody up.
He made his point.
And he made his point.
George White was not a man of understatement or subtleties. His boss at OSS, Stanley Lovell, referred to him as deadly and dedicated. In this note from White's diaries, it says, call Lovell regarding TD. TD was a rather transparent cover for Truth Drug. George White worked with the Truth Drug Committee here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the nation's capital. They experimented with mescaline, scopolamine, and marijuana on unwitting victims. The committee soon learned there was no easy panacea, no truth drug at this stage. But White and later colleagues would not stop trying. The goal remained the same. As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. But it was a discovery here in Basel, Switzerland, at Sandoz Laboratories by Dr. Albert Hoffman that led the intelligence agencies of America to believe that they had found the panacea. The discovery was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The film that you see is considered by many experts to be the closest illustration of the effects of a hallucinogenic.
It was one of the first times that anybody had run into
a powerful drug that was different than anything else that they knew anything about.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA. This is the first time Gittinger has been interviewed publicly.
We could disable a whole city by putting a very small amount on a water supply. After all of these years of us, those of us who are involved in looking for this secret drug, this was the only thing that began to look for the first time like it might be something like that.
The CIA's interest in LSD was intense. The worry was that the Russians would get hold of it. Were the Soviets into LSD?
I'm going to have to say I'm sure they were, but if you ask me to prove it, I've never seen any direct proof of it.
But at one point, intelligence information received from Switzerland said that Sandoz Laboratories was about to put 100 million doses of LSD on the open market. And it caused enough concern within the agency that the United States was prepared to buy the entire supply. However, a slight mistake had been made. The mistake is made public for the first time.
I just found out on a new CIA document that there were no such large quantities of LSD on the market.
Joan Marks has filed numerous Freedom of Information suits against the CIA and has unearthed much new material. He is the author of The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a history of intelligence agency work with mind control. He is a consultant for this report.
What happened is that there was a military attaché in Switzerland, an American officer, who got milligrams and kilograms mixed up. In other words, he made a mistake of thinking 1/1000th of a gram was the same as 1,000 grams, which is a mistake of 1,000,000 times. So when the CIA got the intelligence that there were 100 million doses on the market, in fact, there were 100 doses.
The man who would oversee the CIA's research into drugs and most of the agency's behavior programs is this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview. In their never-ending search for the miracle weapon, CIA operatives searched here in the remote mountain areas of southern Mexico for what up to then had been considered a myth, magic mushrooms. They used this man, a part-time chemist for the CIA, to dupe this man, a vice president of a bank and an amateur mycologist or mushroom expert, to try to get to the magic mushrooms and turn them into a drug. But it would be the amateur, R. Gordon Wasson and his colleagues, who would win the race and develop the drug psilocybin from the magic mushrooms.
We went into the Mazatec area, far from the highways, remote from Mexico City. There we found that rotten bagasse, as it's called, bagasso, covered with mushrooms. These mushrooms I didn't know, had never seen. They were the sacred mushrooms.
Wasson would also discover and record the ancient mystical rites of the mushrooms from a local shaman or magical priestess, Maria Sabina.
And we were seeing incredible sights. They would go slowly or they would go fast as I ordained. All your senses are rendered acute. We say that you see visions, you see hallucinations, but that doesn't begin to tell the story. The hallucinations are only part of it. You hear sounds, you smell things. The night was thrilling.
Word of Wasson's discovery reached the CIA quickly. Dr. James Moore, a University of Delaware chemist, secretly served the CIA preparing deadly chemicals on short notice. Moore was instructed to get close to Wasson and accompany him on another trip to Mexico to get the magic mushrooms. Internal documents show the CIA felt a drug derived from the mushrooms could remain an agency secret.
What in the world were they looking for with the magic mushrooms?
I think the best answer to that is that they were looking for fundamental information on compounds that would be capable of causing changes in behavior, changes in mental attitude.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you, I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. Your question again, what would I have thought had I known that
any of these substances would
have been given to
unwitting persons?
You mean a hostile agent of another government?
No, I mean
think that was probably one of the things they had in mind.
I mean testing it out on an American citizen.
I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
But many drugs were tested in this way. A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic. A former CIA official who worked on these programs describes for the first time how the decision was made. He did not wish to be filmed or recorded. Thus his remarks are read by someone else.
I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line. Every decent kid knows he shouldn't steal, but he does it sometimes. We knew damn well we didn't want anyone else to know what we were doing.
The decision was made to do testing on unwitting victims. It was decided they should be on the fringes of society because they were most vulnerable.
It was the borderline underworld, prostitutes, drug addicts, and other small-timers who would be powerless to seek any kind of revenge in case they found out.
And as their predecessors had a decade earlier, the CIA turned to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official, and by this time, the stories about George White were legendary.
So the waiter says, "You may help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. I paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder, says, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant.
George White did not mind bending the law, and he knew the street well. He was the ideal choice for what the CIA had in mind.
We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs.
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. While the existence of these safe houses was disclosed last year, details of what took place within them has not been told. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets? We learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom. We started to pick up knowledge that could be used in operations.
There would be victims in all of this, but as the agency knew, they couldn't fight back. Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question. The safe houses were not the only testing grounds. Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country. And word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
I know that some of the studies in which the CIA had supported used as subjects people who later became strong proselytizers of LSD. So in that sense, yes, I think it did sustain the perpetuation of the use of the drug. And it's rather ironic, isn't it?
The counter case that I would make in relationship to that is to remember that the people who were doing the research were people who would be doing the research regardless of who was the sponsor. I don't think anybody working in that time in the remotest ever thought that it would blow up into the kind of thing that it did.
History will judge the role of the CIA and other intelligence agencies in unwittingly contributing to the counterculture of the 60s through their intense interest in LSD and other hallucinogenics. But for the moment at least, the argument can be made that the CIA helped usher in the age of Aquarius.
ABC News Close-Up will continue in a moment.
Being careful about my body doesn't just mean major things like regular breast exams. I'm even careful about pain relievers. Plain aspirin sometimes upset my stomach, so I use Bufferin. It adds protection.
I'm careful about what goes into my body. Bufferin gives me an added relief action I want. Tylenol doesn't.
Only one leading tablet has both, an added relief action in many cases that Tylenol never provides, and protection ingredients, Bufferin.
Now I'm careful to get both with Bufferin.
Your sink trap's clogged with grease. Use Crystal Drano.
I'll pour in liquid plumber.
Don't. It may not work on that grease clog.
No?
Crystal Drano will. Look, liquid plumber's quiet. It's not melting that grease.
But Drano is. It broke through. Will Drano hurt metal pipes?
No.
So liquid plumber didn't break that grease clog. I'm switching to Drano.
To make clogs go, better use Drano.
Saturday, live on ABC. The Forest Hills Men's Invitational from the legendary West Side Tennis Club. Then live, third round coverage of the most prestigious ladies golf event. Hollis Stacey goes for her third straight U.S. Women's Open title. And red-hot Nancy Lopez shoots for her elusive first Open victory. And on ABC's Wide World of Sports, rodeo excitement from the Wild West, plus high speeds, high thrills, hydroplane action, championship tennis, golf, and ABC's Wide World of Sports, Saturday.
Wednesday on 8 is Enough.
We got the buggy fever.
The Bradford girls go disco crazy.
Hey, hiya, hun. What do you say we get, down?
And the summer's off to a red-hot start. And Charlie's Angels play the horses.
I want to be a jockey.
But end up in a dead heat with death. Then, the ghost of Jack the Ripper haunts the back streets of Vegas.
Tomorrow, starting at 8, 7 Central and Mountain on ABC.
Covering a span of history such as we are in this report, one can get sidetracked by the so-called glamour and mystery of espionage work or by the exotic qualities of some drugs. But what you can't lose sight of is what all of this would mean in terms of individual human beings. There would be deaths, there would be long-lasting and harmful effects. The best-known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program. Olson left behind a widow, Alice, and 3 children, but it would be years before they learned the real story of his death. Shortly after his suicide, Alice Olson was visited by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who had administered the drug, and by Robert Lashbrook, his deputy, who was the last person with Frank Olson the night of his death.
It was probably to check me out and see whether I was handling myself and handling the situation, whether I was hysterical. And I'm sure they left the house feeling ever so much better because I had been gracious and hospitable to them, so that I must have played right into their hand and made them feel fine.
23 years later, how did you feel about that meeting?
My anger was unbelievable at how I had been duped for this length of time, and the anguish which was unnecessary.
Anyone who knew during all of those years never told Alice Olson the real story of her husband's death. She would discover it by accident more than 2 decades later. In essence, it was a 22-year-long cover-up. Lyman Kirkpatrick was Inspector General of the CIA at the time of Frank Olson's death.
But had not the Olson case occurred within the secret confines of the CIA, would not this case have been a prosecutable case? Perhaps manslaughter?
I would think very definitely prosecutable, and certainly from the point of view of of Mr. Olson, why it should probably have been actionable.
Frank Olson's suicide slowed down the CIA's testing of LSD and other drugs, but only momentarily. The CIA was not the only government agency interested in the possibilities LSD and other drugs presented for mind control. The Army Chemical Corps first started working with the CIA and then branched off on its own. It too tested drugs on unwitting victims, and a death would result. The case of this man, Harold Blower, a tennis pro, seen here with his daughter Elizabeth, is well known. In 1953, Blower was a private patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was given 5 injections of a mescaline derivative that was being tested secretly for the Army Chemical Corps. With the 5th injection, Harold Blower died. As with the Olson case, a 22-year cover-up followed, until finally the Army admitted the real details of Blower's death.
Since the initial news stories of Harold Blower's death, close to 5,000 documents, previously classified, have been released by the Army and obtained by ABC News. They provide valuable insight into Army activities at the time of Blower's death and where the Army went from there with their own drug testing program.
From a previously classified deposition of Dr. James Cattell, who administered the mescaline derivative, on the purpose of the drug testing, to produce symptoms similar to those that you see in schizophrenia, on how much the patient knew about all this. We didn't delineate all the possibilities of what might happen because then you contaminate your experiment. Cattell then relates that he never even knew what drug he had given Harold Blower because of the secrecy of the Army experiments. We didn't know whether it was dog piss. This was secret. This was a secret. We weren't in on it. We asked Blower's daughter Elizabeth for her reaction.
What? How can anybody react to that? I mean, that is so far from what you'd expect from a human being, never mind a doctor, never mind a professional specialist who's supposed to care about people's minds. It's unbelievable.
A suit filed by Elizabeth Barrett against the Army Chemical Corps is now pending in federal court. Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain. The chief researcher was Dr. Russell Monroe, now head of the psychiatry department at the University of Maryland. These are various progress reports written by Dr. Monroe and recently obtained by ABC News. From one of the progress reports, a report of a woman who had electrodes implanted in the brain and was then given LSD and other drugs. She became agitated, cried, lapsed into a trance-like state. Felt as if she were about to have a convulsion, experienced waves of darkness and light, had bizarre sensations in her neck and legs, said somebody was trying to manipulate her body. At this point, Dr. Monroe wrote that the woman was obviously having paranoid ideas.
As a layperson, perhaps you can enlighten me. What therapeutic effect would the type of experiment that I just described have on a patient?
Well, the therapeutic effect would be indirect.
Was this patient aware that she was being given LSD?
Yes, I mean, they were told that they would be given some medication, and they took it 5
Specifically
hours.
LSD?
Well, we told them, I don't think that they would have even known what LSD was then at the time. They were told that they were going to they would be given some medications which might make them feel worse.
Dr. Monroe, what do you think the Army Chemical Corps was looking for in all of this testing?
They were looking for an incapacitating agent, an agent that would not harm the person permanently, but would incapacitate them temporarily. That seemed like a humanistic way to wage a war, if war is necessary.
When James Thornwell was given LSD by Army intelligence in 1961, this time it was no experiment. This time, the express purpose was to peel back Thornwell's brain to bear any secret within it. This time, the Army had gone operational. Thornwell, as reported on ABC last January, was an Army private stationed in Orléans, France. Classified documents were missing from his unit. Thornwell became a suspect. His 2.5-month interrogation included administration of sodium pentothal, hypnosis, isolation, and deprivation of sleep. Army documents obtained by ABC News refer to this interrogation as conventional. Despite this severe questioning, Army intelligence was getting nowhere with Thornwell, and it was decided to slip him LSD. For 16 years, Thornwell never knew what had hit him.
Tell me about the acid.
I'd rather not. It's a bad trip. It's a bad trip. That was a bad trip. The pain was so excruciating. Felt like somebody was sticking me with 1,000,000 pins. You know, just everywhere. Oh, it just... Oh.
You want to stop for me?
I walked around.
You want to stop?
Oh, I can talk. I lived through it. I lived through it. I lived through it.
No charges were ever brought by the Army against Thornwell. He was discharged for psychological disorders. But an Army psychiatric evaluation of Thornwell obtained by ABC News, one which was done prior to Thornwell having been given LSD, says of him, fairly cooperative, oriented, alert, and gave no evidence of psychosis or depression. From the Army's point of view, this type of LSD interrogation was a success. Other documents refer to the exploitability of interrogation subjects, cracking them, keeping them off balance mentally, and providing an economical, speedy, and productive aid to interrogation. From James Thornwell's point of view, it was no success. Thornwell still has serious problems. He's run through 2 marriages. He maintains he can't hold a job, can't concentrate, has nightmares, and feels socially and emotionally isolated. Last fall, Thornwell filed suit against the government in federal court. In a moment, we will examine the closest experimentation to brainwashing that we have uncovered.
Oh, for crying out loud.
Something wrong, Will?
You pick up a paper these days, you learn life isn't as simple as it used to be, and neither's food.
Is that why you eat grape nut cereal?
Yep, you couldn't ask for a simpler cereal. Wheat and barley, vitamins added, no preservatives.
Sure looks simple.
It's got a natural nutty taste.
What's good for breakfast, guys?
How about something nice and simple?
Grape nuts, the simple cereal.
Maxwell House's coffee you can count on.
Maxwell House, good to the last drop. Maxwell House is
Good every time.
Maxwell House is
Good coffee.
good to the last drop. Maxwell House.
Maxwell House, coffee you can count on. Always smells good, always tastes good. Always good to the last drop.
Maxwell House is
Good news.
good to the last drop. Maxwell House.
ABC News Close-Up will continue in a moment.
Special baseball. The Yankees take on the Angels Friday night on ABC.
This is a heavy-duty stick-up, and this is a good place for it.
New heavy-duty stick-ups from Airwick for small places with big odors.
This is David Shoemaker in the news at this hour. District police have charged a young Northeast woman with the weekend kidnapping of that day-old baby. Sources say the woman was pregnant and afraid she'd lost her own child in the accident, and that's what motivated the kidnapping. 'Twas the night before Skylab, and we'll have the latest on its fate and ours. Testimony before Congress today on battered wives. Some of the victims are battered wives. A rock and roll star put on probation for income tax evasion. The condition is he must put on 1,000 hours of concerts for charities. And we'll be talking with a local teenager who won a gold medal at the Pan Am Games. Join us at 11.
Reach for the sun. Hello, sunshine. Reach for the sun. Hello, sunshine. Hello, Mountain Dew.
Nothing else tastes or feels quite like Mountain Dew, or goes down as smooth like a soft breeze on a lazy afternoon.
Reach for the sun. Reach for Mountain Dew.
By far, the most chilling experiments we have uncovered took place at this Gothic estate called Ravens Crag, halfway up Mount Royal in Montreal. It houses the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry of McGill University. It was here that the CIA funded a series of experiments, severe experiments. The work was done by the Institute's then director, Dr. Ewan Cameron. It is the closest experimentation to brainwashing yet disclosed. His work, unprecedented in psychiatry, consisted of 3 areas which he called sleep therapy, psychic driving, and the ultimate depatterning. Dr. Maurice Dongier, current head of the Allen Memorial Institute.
In his psychic driving, so-called type of therapy, he would give the patient intensive electric treatment in order to make the patient regress deeply, become forgetful, and then he would attempt to implant new ideas in the mind of the patient.
Now, to a layman, it would appear that Dr. Cameron was trying to take the slate and wipe it clean, the slate being the mind. In other words, brainwashing.
Exactly, that's a very good comparison.
Brainwashing.
Yes, if you like.
Val Orlico of Winnipeg, Canada, the wife of a member of the Canadian Parliament, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. She entered the Allen Memorial Institute because of severe depression. She describes for the first time publicly the LSD therapy and psychic driving treatment that she was given by Dr. Cameron.
And then the drug began to take hold very rapidly because it was an IV injection. And things became very furry and very frightening, and had a lot of sensations that it's very difficult to recall. Nobody explained it to me. Nobody ever asked me if I was willing to do it or anything.
He had this feeling that he would be able to get through the resistance of illness and to reach deep changes very quickly.
Did he?
I don't think that when you look at that in retrospect, the hopes that he had have been in any way fulfilled.
But Cameron would plunge on. The next step was what he called psychic driving. This involved almost endless tape-recorded messages and more drugs for the patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct controlled changes in personality.
I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody could give to anybody in the world. And I became more and more despondent and more angry. I just became so despondent that I thought I can't live like this any longer. And I thought I would just go out and throw myself underneath the cars on McGregor. I stood on the curb of that street, and I stood there, and I thought, okay, go. Okay, go. And then I thought, what if you're not killed? What if you're just maimed? What if you don't die and you live and you can't even talk anymore? And I couldn't do it.
The most severe technique Cameron used was de-patterning. He described it as breaking up the existing patterns of behavior by means of intensive electroshock therapy with prolonged periods of sleep. He carried out these experiments in something he called the sleep rooms.
People in there were like babies. They cried, and they were very disoriented. And we were very afraid of the sleep room. We used to walk very carefully against the side of the corridor that was opposite the sleep room with our backs to the wall when we'd go by.
Cameron used this combined sleep electroshock treatment on patients as long as 30 days. One patient he kept asleep for 65 days. Cameron retired, and his successor, Dr. Robert Cleghorn, ordered a follow-up study on the patients treated with Cameron's de-patterning method.
It showed that it was no more beneficial in its result than the use of more conservative methods.
But the follow-up study showed that 60% of those who had been de-patterned still had amnesia for periods of anywhere from 6 months to 10 years. That's quite a memory loss, isn't it?
That is a memory loss. Indeed it is. It's more, I think, more than desirable.
In retrospect, does Dr. Cameron's experimentation and his treatment appear harsh?
I would say yes. I mean, this forceful type of approach that I was describing to you is definitely, it can be said that it's harsh.
I wouldn't call it harsh. I would say it was harder on the staff than it was on the patients, because these people had to be fed, and they had to be cared for, and they had to be given sufficient fluid and food and toileted and so on and so forth. It was a very difficult thing for the staff to follow these patients properly and see that they did well.
Well, I'm glad he was concerned for the staff. But damn it all, I wouldn't. I could have maybe had a different kind of life. And that makes me angry and sad, and I don't know how to explain how I feel, really. I just.
How did you feel when you learned that Dr. Cameron's experimentation was financed by the CIA?
Well, I thought, oh, I can't even use the word that I thought, because I thought, that bastard. And he was too smart. He knew who he was working for. And, excuse me, but I just, I just can't, sometimes I can't believe it, and yet I know it's true.
If you had the opportunity to say something to the people at the Central Intelligence Agency who financed this study, what would you say?
I realize the CIA is a very important organization, and they have a very important job to do, but God, it surely doesn't have to be done on people who are totally incapable of knowing what's happening or having any defense against it. And I can't imagine the mentality of people who would do this. I just can't.
As for Dr. Cameron, he died in 1966 while mountain climbing. A colleague wrote of Cameron, "For him, the ends justified the means. And when one is dealing with the waste of human potential, it is easy to adopt this stance." Dr. Cameron seemed ideally suited for what the CIA had in mind.
America is adapting to the shape of things to come. Triumph TR7 with 5-speed transmission or optional automatic. wide steel belted radials, front disc brakes, front end spoiler, rack and pinion steering. Triumph TR7. No other sports car looks like it. No other sports car drives like it. Triumph TR7. The shape.
Hey, don't worry. They just got lucky. I'm sorry. I let us down. Forget it. We'll beat them next week. No, I really let us down. Come on. How about a Michelob Light, huh?
Michelob makes a light beer?
Sure.
The good taste of Michelob Light. Don't just compare it to other light beers. Compare it to your regular beer. It's that good.
This Michelob Light is great. Hey, you know what our real problem was today?
Yeah, you were terrible.
Good taste runs in the family.
The many roles I play call for many hairstyles. So I use hot curlers, blow dryers, things that can be brutal to hair. I switched from one conditioner to another looking for help. Then came Alberto VO5 hot oil treatment. It works just like a salon hot oil treatment, but takes less time and money. I just heat a tube, smooth it in, and shampoo. My hair's left silky, shiny, more manageable than I ever dreamed. Alberto VO5 hot oil treatment. I'll never switch again.
Thursday.
I can move a few of my things over this morning.
There's a scandal in the 12th when Wojo gets a roommate.
Hi.
In a Barney Miller special.
I'm a prisoner of my biological urges.
Sorry to hear that. Then authorities say this Texas motorcycle gang murdered a federal judge.
People are always scared of something they don't understand, and they don't understand us, so they're scared.
Geraldo Rivera investigates dope, death, and the banditos on 2020.
Thursday, starting at 9, 8 Central and Mountain on ABC.
It was the Cold War, and especially the trial of Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, who was forced to testify in a Hungarian court that he was a spy. And then later, the Korean War, with the coerced and mainly fraudulent confessions of American servicemen.
My examination took place on the...
That would spark intense interest in intelligence circles about brainwashing. The CIA secretly commissioned a study of communist brainwashing methods at the Cornell University Medical Center. A leader of that study was Dr. Lawrence Hinkle. He explains first the Russian method of controlling and breaking a person.
Absolutely isolated from everyone else, with one man whose job it is to get you to write the extent to which you are a criminal. In this setting, you can get people to do most anything, do you see? Because you don't have to lay a hand on them. And by the time you get through and you go up before the judge, the fellow says, were you a spy? He says, yes, I was a spy. The Chinese never really had this kind of a state police system. They would get him in, and all this fellow does is ask you to write, rewrite, and talk to him about your whole life.
Graduated from pilot training in 1949.
While the purpose of the study was to find out about communist brainwashing techniques, CIA documents show that the agency was interested in developing mind control methods of its own to precondition and control Chinese living in this country to be sent back to their homeland as CIA agents.
What do you think they were looking for?
Well, I think they weren't looking for agents or anything like that.
Yet the agency's perception of the work you were doing, in CIA documents we have examined, it says that the project that was being done here, they intended to use everything learned about the new agents to induce them to, quote, to perform acts of a complex, purposeful nature.
Yeah, but that was never done.
The effects of which may be out of keeping with the individual's previous behavior.
That sort of thing was never done. Those people were not, that was, when they first came here, the first people they sent up to see us, you see, were operational type people from the CIA with some rather wild ideas.
Okay, this is their perception of it, if I could just continue.
No, it wasn't their perception of it either. No, it wasn't.
Dangerous to his being, contrary to any previous consciously expressed intentions and interests, contrary to the good of the individual, and subversive to the goals for which he is consciously working.
I understand all this talk. But the situation was, you see, those things were never done because of wise people on both sides. We were not able to do this nor interested in it.
They were, though.
Some of the low-level people were, but the high-level people were not, to tell you the truth.
But documents clearly show that the CIA was attempting to develop agents over whom they had as much control as possible. Agents who would perform tasks contrary to their own good.
Normally conditioned American who's been trained to kill and then to have no memory of having killed. His brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry cleaned.
Is a Manchurian candidate, controlled by others to do things against his will, possible?
It was a remarkable film because, as far as I'm concerned, it made something totally impossible seem absolutely credible.
I would say the answer is yes, but there are many qualifications to that.
Dr. Milton Klein, a psychologist, a clinical and experimental hypnotist, and unpaid consultant to the CIA.
The qualifications would be the subject selected to produce the kind of behavior that you wish, the amount of time, the procedures that are utilized, and the motivations of the people who are designing, executing, and administering the procedures. You're asking whether an individual can be, under hypnosis, influenced, coerced, persuaded, shaped to perform an antisocial act, or a destructive act, or an act of violence. My answer would be yes.
Captain Marco, will you be good enough to lend Raymond your pistol, please? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Ben.
Sure, kid. Shoot Bobby, Raymond. Through the forehead.
Yes, ma'am.
How valuable a tool can hypnosis be in the intelligence field?
None whatsoever. It has absolutely no use because nobody's ever been able to do that I know of, do it in an operationally feasible way. I'm not in any way saying that hypnosis doesn't take place. I'm not saying there's nothing to it.
I would say that most government agencies concerned with intelligence operations have been looking to hypnosis as a tool for a variety of purposes, one of which is to carry out and to execute certain intelligence operations on a basis where they would not have to rely completely on some of their own emotional reactions. Actually,
would that entail murder?
It could, if you consider that an act of killing someone under circumstances of war is murder. I think one has to define what that means.
Under circumstances of peace?
Under circumstances of peace, it would be murder.
Another former CIA agent says that Fidel Castro at one time was considered as a possible target for a Manchurian candidate.
Castro was naturally our discussion point. Could you get somebody gung-ho enough that they would go in and get him? But if you have 100% control of a guy, you have 100% dependency. If something happens and you haven't programmed it in, you've got a problem.
So in the end, it was decided that a Manchurian candidate was not feasible. But the search for mind control continued. But could the mind be controlled? Perhaps not. But is human behavior predictable? In this area, the CIA did make a significant breakthrough. A personality assessment system designed by the agency's chief psychologist, John Gittinger. It comes close to being able to predict how humans will behave.
It's really a descriptive system, an attempt to try to describe personality in a relatively systematic way so that hopefully you can get some kind of an idea to predict what the behavior between different kinds of individuals.
Gittinger's system had many uses in intelligence work. One was to draw personality portraits of world leaders. Using Gittinger's system, the agency concluded the Shah of Iran is a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac whose basic problems resulted from an overbearing father. And there were other applications. Your assessment staff played a key role in helping other governments pick their police intelligence agencies, including, we've learned, the Korean CIA, Uruguayan National Police. Can you tell us about this?
No.
Author John Marks.
The former #2 CIA man in Uruguay told me how in 1966, John Gittinger and an assistant traveled down to Uruguay and gave the tests in order to select members of the Uruguayan intelligence service. A psychologist who used to work for the CIA told me in 1961 he personally traveled to South Korea as part of an American CIA effort to set up the Korean CIA and to give the personality tests to candidates for the Korean CIA to choose the best man for their secret police.
But one of the basic functions of Gittinger's system was finding the vulnerabilities of an agent, a double agent, or a potential agent.
In its applicability to intelligence work, isn't the PAS system looking for a person's soft spot?
Well, of course, the answer to that is yes, but I hasten to say soft spot. This is what I consider a negative word.
Of the hundreds of behavioral projects undertaken by the CIA, Gittinger's appears to have been one of the more successful and more conventional. Other experiments were not as conventional. Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research. In this experiment, the bull is sedated. Electrodes are implanted in its brain. Delgado transmits an electronic impulse to the center of the bull's brain. Delgado has remote control of the animal. Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man. Other areas were examined through the 60s and 70s. Brain surgery, psychosurgery, creation of amnesia, parapsychology, manipulation of genes. Even though past and present CIA officials have indicated this kind of work ended in 1963.
Whole truth, nothing but...
And one of those who took part in these programs.
Thank you, sir.
In 1977, the Senate subcommittee heard testimony from many of them, but the testimony was not that revealing. According to one of them, they agreed amongst themselves to keep the inquiry within bounds that would satisfy the committee. Former narcotics officer Charles Siragusa says that he was asked to limit his testimony by the man he reported to at the CIA.
He wanted me not to say anything.
To perjure yourself.
That's right. Well, either that, I'd have to perjure myself or take the Fifth Amendment. And I'm not about to take the Fifth Amendment for anybody.
Okay.
Former CIA chemist Robert Lashbrook testified he had no first-hand knowledge of the agency-run safe houses when, in fact, he supervised one of them.
There was very little...
And according to George White's diaries, was at a safe house when White conducted what he called an LSD surprise experiment. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, whom we recently filmed near his California home, oversaw many of the CIA behavioral programs. He retired in 1973 and destroyed the records of this work. In sort of a valedictory letter, Dr. Gottlieb wrote that he and his colleagues had been able to maintain contact with the leading edge of developments in the field of biological and chemical control of human behavior. Dr. Gottlieb also testified before the Senate subcommittee, but from an anteroom where he could not be filmed because of what his lawyer termed health and cardiac problems. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview. And what of George White, the man who helped the agency in so many of its programs? He would retire here to Stinson Beach, California. And shortly before his death, he wrote to his boss at the CIA, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and summed up his career by saying, "It was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?"
Has mind control been achieved? From all of the available evidence, it appears doubtful. The human will has prevailed up to this point. But as we have seen, work is continuing in this field, work that we still don't know very much about. How deeply are the Russians and other dictatorships into all of this? We really can't say, and the CIA is reluctant to give out information about it. But the basic question remains, what place does all of this have within a democracy? One final point should be made. As one of the persons who worked on these programs told us, we are very capable, conscientious, and very dedicated scientists working for our country. Their work speaks for itself. This is Paul Altmaier for ABC News. Good night.
Here's a great idea.
Potato peeler?
Nope.
Hair curler.
It's Vanish Bow Freshener. Freshness in a snap. Snap it under the rim and it freshens two ways. It's always there to freshen. Then when water hits it, extra deodorizer and detergents are released, working best when and where you need it. When the bowl's fresh, the bathroom's fresher.
Snappy idea. Vanish bulk freshener.
Vanish for a cleaner bowl and a fresher bathroom.
What do doctors recommend for pain today? This report shows doctors' #1 choice is the pain reliever in Anacin. 5 million recommendations last year for pain of headache, backache, minor arthritis, and muscle ache. The ingredient in Anacin is the doctor's #1 choice. Anacin is strong, a special combination of medical ingredients free of stomach upset for millions everywhere. The ingredient in Anacin, doctor's #1 choice.
Stay tuned for local news next. Then live from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, ABC News will track the approach of Skylab as it nears re-entry. Skylab, the final hours. Right after Twiggy and Dirk Benedict of Battlestar Galactica star in I Want...
Wake up to reality. Nothing ever goes as planned in this accursed world. The longer you live, the more you will realize that the only things that truly exist in this reality are merely pain, suffering, and futility. Listen, everywhere you look in this world, wherever there is light, there will always be shadows to be found as well.
Sit, Ubu, sit. Good dog.